Close your eyes and imagine the dim glow of a medieval forge, where the only light comes from the radiating charcoal hearth. Feel the steady, rhythmic breath of the bellows as raw iron transforms into essential tools under a steady hammer. Let the soft hiss of cooling metal lull you into a deep, peaceful sleep. Welcome back, traveler, to Boring History, a quiet corner of the world where we leave behind the noise of today and gently wander into the stillness of the past. Here, the fires of history burn low and steady, casting long shadows over forgotten stories. We are not here for kings and conquests, but for the quiet, strange, and sometimes unsettling moments that time nearly buried. Before you get comfy, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, only if you're actually enjoying it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious to see the mix of places and time zones hanging out here together. Segment 1: Before the sun rose. Long before the village stirred, long before the roosters split the silence and the first curls of cooking smoke rose from cottage chimneys, the blacksmith was already moving through the dark. He rose not by alarm but by instinct, the body clock of a man whose life had been governed by fire and iron since boyhood, whose muscles remembered the schedule even when the mind was still half dreaming. The world outside his door was wholly black. There were no street lamps, no lit windows in the houses around him, no distant orange glow of a city on the horizon. There was only the cold, the dark, and the faint smell of old charcoal drifting from the forge across the yard. He dressed by feel rough linen shirt, heavy woolen breeches, leather apron hung on the same peg it always occupied. His hands, even in the dark, moved with the certainty of deep habit. These were not the hands of a man who fumbled. They were broad and thick-fingered, ridged with old burned scars and hardened calluses that had built up over years like bark on a tree. The skin across his knuckles was permanently stained with iron oxide, a reddish-brown tint that no amount of washing fully removed. His hands told his whole story before he ever spoke a word. He stepped outside and the cold hit him properly, in the depths of a medieval English winter, or a Norman one, or a German one. The story was much the same across the continent. Mornings before dawn were genuinely brutal. Frost lay on the ground like a white skin. Breath came in visible plumes. The mud of the yard had frozen overnight into hard ridges that caught at the soles of his boots. He crossed the yard quickly, not running, but with the efficient, purposeful stride of a man who had made this crossing 10,000 times and had no patience for dawdling in the cold. The forge building waited at the far end of the yard, a low squat structure of rough stone with a roof of heavy timber and fired clay tiles. Its single small window dark. The door was heavy oak, iron hinged his own work, or his father's before him, and it groaned as he pulled it open. Inside, the air was different. It was still cold, yes, but it held a quality the outdoor air lacked. A dense, mineral warmth threaded through the chill. The memory of yesterday's fire still breathed into the stones of the hearth. The smell was distinctive, and to him entirely comforting. Charcoal, ash, iron dust, oil, the faint sulphurous edge of worked metal, the dry woody smell of the bellows leather. For a boy who had grown up in this building, who had spent more of his waking hours within these walls than anywhere else on earth, this smell was simply the smell of home and work and purpose. He did not light a candle immediately. He didn't need to. The layout of the shop was mapped so completely onto his body that darkness was no real obstacle. He knew exactly how many steps it was from the door to the hearth, exactly where the tongs hung on the wall, exactly the height of the anvil block and the distance between it and the quench barrel. He moved through the dark shop like a man moving through his own mind, unhurried, certain, touching familiar things in familiar sequence. At the hearth, he crouched and laid his hand near the ash, feeling for warmth. There, under the grey surface ash, deeper in the bed, a faint radiant heat still clung to the coals from yesterday's long day of work. This was the blacksmith's small daily gift to himself. He never let the fire go fully cold if he could avoid it. A cold forge took far longer and far more fuel to bring up to working temperature than one that still held a residual warmth in its stones and coal bed. Managing the fire's continuity from day to day was itself a skill, and a frugal one, in a world where fuel had to be purchased or arranged, where charcoal was made by specialist charcoal burners and carted in on wagons. Nothing was wasted. He raked the ash back gently with a long iron poker, uncovering the dull orange heart of the remaining coals. They glowed weakly, patiently, like something alive and waiting. He fed them carefully, first dry wood shavings and small sticks to encourage the flame. then larger pieces of charcoal added gradually as the heat built. The bellows were a large double-action device mounted on a wooden frame beside the hearth, operated by a long handle. He began to pump, slowly and steadily, each breath of air making the coals brighten perceptibly. The orange deepened, spread, and the first small tongues of flame appeared. The forge was waking up. In the growing light of the fire, which was the only light in the building, since no dawn yet showed at the small window, the shop came slowly into view around him. The walls were black with years of accumulated soot, the stone blocks between the timbers invisible behind their coating of carbon. Tools hung in their designated places on iron hooks, tongs of various sizes and jaw shapes, each designed for a specific class of work. Hammers ranging from the heavy sledge used for initial shaping to small, precise crossbeam hammers for detail work, chisels and hardies and fullers and swages, each a specialized tool with a specific function in the process of persuading iron into new shapes. There were drifts for punching and enlarging holes, and picks and mandrels for forming rings and curves. To a visitor the array might have seemed bewildering, an arsenal of strangely shaped iron objects. To the smith it was a vocabulary, and he was literate in every piece of it. The anvil occupied its central position on the great hardwood stump with the gravity and solemnity of a throne. It was old, this anvil, older perhaps than the building around it, passed down from a previous smith or purchased at considerable expense from a specialist foundry. Its surface was marked by decades of work, small nicks and dents on the edges where chisels had glanced off, a slight hollow worn into the face near the far end where the most frequent hammer blows landed, a dark patina of iron and scale and quench water that no amount of polishing would erase. The smith ran his hand across its face as he passed, a habitual gesture, almost affectionate, checking for surface temperature, feeling for any roughness that needed addressing, or simply making contact with the thing he worked alongside every day of his life. The quench barrel stood near the anvil, a wide wooden barrel half filled with water, which the apprentice was responsible for refreshing each morning. On the floor around the hearth, yesterday's scale lay scattered, the thin flakes of iron oxide that spoil off hot metal when it is struck, raining down like tiny dark leaves with every hammer blow. Sweeping these up was another morning task, though not the first one. First came fire, everything else followed from fire. By now the coals were burning well, the forge putting out real heat. He stepped back slightly, feeling the warmth on his face and forearms, evaluating by long experience how the fire was behaving. Charcoal fires have a personality. They can burn bright and fast, consuming fuel quickly and producing intense localized heat, or they can be managed to burn deeper and more evenly, producing a sustained heat better for bringing large pieces of iron up to temperature slowly. Different jobs wanted different fires. A morning of making small, precise items, knife blades, nails, small fittings, wanted a contained, very hot fire at the center of the hearth. A morning of working heavy stock for agricultural tools wanted a broader, deeper heat. The smith had already decided the night before, or perhaps as he dressed this morning, what work was waiting for him. He knew what the fire needed to be, and he built it accordingly. As the fire strengthened, the first grey light of dawn began to show at the small window set high in the wall. It arrived not as brightness, but as a slow lessening of the dark, a gradual transition from black to deep blue-grey. In the contrast between this dim exterior light and the bright hot glow of the hearth, the forge fire seemed to burn more intensely than ever, a fierce orange heart against the soft grey world. The smith continued to pump the bellows in steady rhythm, not hurrying. He had time. The iron wouldn't be ready to work for a while yet, and even when it was, there was a quality to these early morning hours that belonged to preparation, to the quiet ordering of the day's work in the mind, that he would have been reluctant to sacrifice to haste. There was a second building adjacent to the smithy, a small lean-to where the apprentice slept. The boy was perhaps 12 or 13, taken on 2 winters ago from a village family that had more children than food. He would be awake soon, drawn by the smell of smoke and the sound of the bellows. His first job of the morning would be to bring water for the quench barrel, then to sweep the scale from the floor, then to eat whatever food there was quickly before the real work began. The smith expected diligence and silence in roughly equal measure. He had been an apprentice himself once, under a master considerably less patient than he liked to think he was, and he remembered clearly the importance of watchfulness, of learning by observation rather than by question. The craft did not live in words. It lived in the hands, in the eyes, in the quality of attention a young person brought to standing in this building and watching someone who truly knew what they were doing. Outside, the village was beginning to stir. A dog barked somewhere across the common. A door banged. The soft lowing of cattle from the byre down the lane. The world was assembling itself for another day of medieval life, which is to say, a day of hard, physical, largely outdoor labor, in which the margin between enough and not enough was never as wide as anyone would have liked. The smith's work was essential to all of it. Every farmer in the village depended on iron tools to work his land. The mill depended on iron fittings to function. The carpenter and the wheelwright needed iron nails and hoops and brackets. The priest had iron hinges on his church door. The lord of the manor, if there was one nearby, needed iron for his horses, his gates, his weaponry. In a world built almost entirely of wood, leather, and stone, iron was the skeleton that held everything together, and the blacksmith was the man who made and maintained that skeleton. He was not, in most medieval villages, a wealthy man. He was comfortable, better fed than a field laborer, more secure in his position than many, possessed of a skill that could not be easily replaced or done without. But his life was not easy. His days were long, his work physically punishing, his shop a place of genuine danger where burns, flying scale, and the risk of serious injury from heavy tools were routine hazards, managed by care and experience rather than eliminated. He worked standing, almost entirely, for the full length of each day. He went to bed with aching shoulders and forearms every night, and rose before dawn every morning. He did this for the whole of his working life. And yet there is something unmistakable in how the medieval smith appears across the historical record, in guild documents, in illuminated manuscripts, in the archaeological evidence of their shops and tools, which suggests that this work was understood as more than mere labor. The ability to transform raw or rough iron bars into precise, functional objects by the application of fire, knowledge, and physical skill was regarded, in medieval culture, with something approaching wonder. The forge was mysterious to those who never worked in one. The transformation it enabled, black iron rod becoming shining, cutting edge, rough lump becoming delicate hinge, crude metal becoming a tool that would outlast its maker by generations, felt, to the medieval mind, like something extraordinary, not quite magic, but not entirely unlike it either. The smith pumped the bellows one more time, checked the color of the coals with a practiced eye, and decided he was nearly ready. He selected a length of iron from the stock, leaning against the wall, a bar of moderate weight, good for the morning's first job, which was a set of plough fittings promised to the farmer across the lane by the end of the week. He laid it across the edge of the hearth, just outside the hottest center of the fire, to begin warming from cold. Starting cold iron directly in the hottest part of the fire risked thermal shock and could damage the metal. You brought it up gradually, as with most things that mattered. The apprentice appeared at the door, red-cheeked and wide-eyed, carrying the water bucket with both hands. The smith nodded to him. The boy set to work without being told. The fire roared softly in the hearth. The iron bar began, by almost imperceptible degrees, to warm. The day had begun. Segment 2, the heart of the forge. To understand how a medieval blacksmith worked, you must first understand fire, not as a background element or a source of light, but as the primary tool, the first and most essential instrument in the entire process of turning raw iron into something useful. Everything that happened in a medieval smithy happened because of the fire, or in relationship to it. The fire was not a means to an end. It was the beginning of all ends. Without a proper fire, the right temperature, the right character, managed correctly throughout the day, no amount of skill at the anvil could produce good work. The fire came first, and the smith, who did not deeply understand fire, could not truly be called a smith at all. The hearth itself, called the forge, which is the word from which the whole building and occupation take their name, was a carefully constructed piece of working infrastructure. In the medieval period, forge hearths varied considerably in their design depending on region, period, and the resources available to the smith, but they shared certain fundamental features. Most were raised beds of stone, brick, or iron plate, elevated to a working height that allowed the smith to stand and tend his fire and handle metal in and out of the heat without stooping. The raising served a practical purpose. It placed the fire at a height where the smith could see into it clearly, where the bellows blast could be directed efficiently into the base of the coal bed, and where the metal being heated could be easily rotated and repositioned without the awkward bending that would come with a ground-level fire. The fuel was charcoal, almost universally. This is a point worth dwelling on, because it is one of the details that most clearly separates medieval smithing from the mental image many people carry of a man simply burning logs or coal to heat metal. Wood, as a direct fuel for a forge fire, is inadequate. It does not burn hot enough, it produces too much smoke and flame, and it burns unevenly, making temperature management difficult. Modern blacksmiths often use coke, a processed form of coal with many of the impurities burned out, but coke was not available to medieval smiths. What they had, and what worked beautifully for their purposes, was charcoal, wood that had been slowly burned in a low-oxygen environment to drive off water, resins, and volatile compounds, leaving behind almost pure carbon in the physical structure of the original wood. Charcoal burns cleanly, at very high temperatures, and with a degree of controllability that makes it ideal for forge work. When packed into a hearth bed and supplied with a steady air blast from bellows, a charcoal fire can reach temperatures between 1100 and 1300 degrees Celsius, more than enough to bring iron to a workable, malleable state, and sufficient under the right conditions to achieve welding heat, where two pieces of iron pressed together will actually fuse. The production of charcoal was itself a significant medieval industry, carried out by specialist workers called colliers, who managed large slow-burning piles of wood in forest clearings, covering them with earth and tending them for days at a time to ensure the slow oxygen-limited combustion that produced good charcoal rather than ash. The smith was therefore dependent on this whole other chain of skilled labor operating in the forests, and the supply and cost of charcoal was a real economic concern for any working smithy. The bellows were the lungs of the fire. Without a constant supply of air, even a charcoal fire will die back to a dull smolder inadequate for serious metalwork. The bellows forced air into the base of the fire through a tuyere, an iron or clay nozzle set into the back of the hearth at the level of the coal bed, and this air blast fed the combustion directly, raising the temperature in the heart of the fire dramatically compared to what the same coals would produce, burning freely. Medieval bellows came in two main types: the single-action bellows, which delivered a blast of air only on the compression stroke and a useless intake of air on the expansion, creating a pulsing rather than continuous flow, and the double-action bellows, more sophisticated and more effective, which delivered air on both strokes by means of a divided chamber with non-return valves, producing a much steadier and more powerful air supply. The progression toward double-action bellows was one of the small but significant technological improvements in medieval smithing, because a steadier air blast meant a more even and controllable fire, which made the smith's temperature management both easier and more precise. Operating the bellows was physically demanding work. Large shop bellows, the kind used in a serious working forge, required sustained pumping, a rhythmic, up and down or back and forth motion maintained for the whole duration of a heat, which might be anywhere from 1 to 5 minutes, depending on the size of the piece being heated. In a well-organized medieval smithy with one or more apprentices, bellows work was typically assigned to the junior person, not because it required no skill, but because it required a specific kind of sustained physical effort combined with attentiveness, rather than the nuanced technical judgment of the master's work. The apprentice learned to pump the bellows at a rate and rhythm that matched what the smith needed, not too fast and not too slow, keeping the fire at the right temperature for the current work. Too little air in the fire cooled, the iron didn't reach working heat, time and fuel were wasted. Too much air in the fire burned overly hot and oxidizing, potentially damaging the surface of the iron ore, bringing it to welding heat when that wasn't wanted. Getting it right was itself a learned skill, communicated between master and apprentice by glances and small gestures developed over time into an almost wordless language. The coal bed of the hearth was not flat. A skilled smith built his fire in a specific shape, a domed or nest-like arrangement, of coals with a hot core at the center where the metal sat, surrounded by a bed of coals that were burning less intensely and could be pushed inward to maintain the heat as the inner coals burned down. The metal being heated was buried in this nest, not simply laid on top of the fire. Burying the iron in the coals surrounded it with heat from all sides simultaneously, heating it more evenly and efficiently than surface contact with flame could achieve. The smith learned to pack the coals around a piece of iron in a way that matched the geometry of what he was trying to heat, burying the tip of a bar deeply for maximum heat at the working end, or spreading the coals more broadly when heating a wider section that needed to come up to temperature evenly along its length. Managing the fire throughout the day was a continuous task threaded through all the other work of the shop. The charcoal burned down steadily, and new fuel had to be added regularly, but not carelessly. Adding too much fresh charcoal at once would suppress the fire temporarily as the new material absorbed heat before catching properly. Adding too little meant the fire began to die back between heats, wasting time as the smith waited for temperature to recover. The best forges operated with an apprentice whose primary job was to monitor the fuel level and add charcoal in small, careful amounts at regular intervals, keeping the fire topped up without smothering it, a task that sounds simple and is in practice anything but. The temperature of the fire also needed to be matched to the work at hand. Iron is not a single material behaving in a single way. Wrought iron, which was the most common material in medieval smithing, made directly from or in a bloomery furnace, retaining fibrous slag inclusions that actually gave it good working qualities, behaves differently under the hammer at different temperatures. Steel, which in the medieval period meant iron with a higher carbon content produced by careful bloomery work or by cementation processes, required different heat management still. Wrought iron could be worked over a relatively wide temperature range without serious risk of damage. Higher carbon steel was more sensitive, becoming prone to burning actual combustion of the iron with oxygen, destroying the surface of the metal irreversibly if brought to hot, and becoming brittle and cracking under the hammer if worked too cool. The smith had to know what material he was working with and manage his fire accordingly, which is another reason why the skill of reading the fire, knowing what temperature the metal was at by its color, was so fundamental. Water played a role in fire management too. The smith would sometimes sprinkle water on the edge of the coal bed to produce steam, which helped to consolidate loose charcoal and fill gaps that could allow air to bypass the air blast and reduce efficiency. Small amounts of water on the surface of the fire could also be used to direct the heat somewhat, dampening cooler areas to push the effective working zone toward the center. These were subtle techniques, the kind of thing not easily described in words and best understood by watching an experienced smith use them. Knowing not just that they existed but when and why to deploy them came only from long practice. The layout of the forge building was organized entirely around the fire and the work that radiated from it. The hearth was typically positioned toward one end or wall of the building, with the anvil close enough that a smith could carry a piece of hot iron from fire to anvil in a few quick steps, but not so close that the heat of the forge impaired working at the anvil or created a dangerous proximity of hot coals and flying scale. The quench barrel was near the anvil, because rapid movement from anvil to water was sometimes necessary, and a few extra steps in the wrong moment could mean a ruined piece or a burn. Tool storage was arranged so that the most frequently used items were closest to hand, hanging on the wall at a height the smith could reach without looking, laid in a specific order so that the right tool could be found without searching. Time spent looking for a tool while holding hot iron was time the metal was cooling, and in smithing, as in most skilled trades, working efficiently was not about hurrying, but about organizing the work environment so that every motion counted. In the heat of a working day, the forge fire became something almost atmospheric, a constant presence filling the shop with radiated warmth, light, and sound. The roar and hiss of the bellows blast, the crackle of burning charcoal, the occasional pop of scales spalling from hot metal, the deep orange and white light that pulsed with each pump of the bellows, all of this created an environment quite unlike anything else in medieval daily life. It was loud, hot, physically demanding, and in its way entirely beautiful. Men who worked in forges all their lives came to live inside this environment, as naturally as men in other trades lived inside the smell of wood shavings or the texture of cut stone. It was the medium of their expertise, the world in which they were most fully themselves. That fire controlled, understood, continuously managed, was the heart of everything. Without it, the anvil was just a lump of iron, the hammers just weights on handles, the tongs just awkward grips. With it, in the hands of someone who had spent years learning to speak its language, the forge fire was the force that turned raw material into the tools that built medieval civilization. Segment 3. Reading the fire. There is a moment, somewhere in a young blacksmith's apprenticeship, when something shifts. He has been pumping the bellows for months, sweeping the floor, carrying water, watching his master work from the corner of his eye, while pretending to be occupied with lesser tasks. He has watched iron go into the fire black and come out glowing. He has watched his master pull it to the anvil and begin to strike, and he has seen the orange light of the hot metal fade through red to black as it cooled, and the hammer blows became sharper and more ringing, and eventually the master returned the piece to the fire without a word. And then one morning, standing beside the hearth while his master is occupied with something else, he looks at a piece of iron buried in the coals, and he knows, not by instruction, not by memorized rule, but by a new, developing intuition, that it is nearly ready. He can feel it somehow, in the quality of the light coming off the metal, in something about the way it looks. He is beginning to read the fire. This ability to judge the temperature of iron by its color is the foundational perceptual skill of blacksmithing, and it is not learned quickly or from a book. It is the product of long, attentive watching, of seeing hot iron thousands of times under different conditions and in different lights, of making mistakes and correct judgments, and gradually building a reliable inner map of what each color means and what it demands. In the medieval period, when the thermometer did not exist, and the very concept of a numerical temperature scale was centuries in the future, this visual reading of metal heat was not just the traditional method, it was the only method. The smith's eyes were his thermometer. His accumulated experience was his temperature gauge. There was no instrument to consult, and no number to check. There was only the color, and what the color meant, and what you did about it. The color sequence that iron passes through as it heats is worth describing carefully, because it is both physically fascinating and practically critical. At room temperature, iron is gray-black, reflecting little light. As it begins to warm, reaching temperatures around 200 to 300 degrees Celsius, it remains visually unchanged to the eye in normal light. But around 400 degrees, it begins to show the first faint signs of heat. A very dark, dull red that is almost more of an absence of grayness than a positive color, visible primarily in low light or darkness. This is sometimes called black heat. The metal is dangerously hot to touch, but shows almost no visual warning in normal daylight. Burns from black heat iron were among the most common injuries in a smithy, because a piece left near the forge to warm might look cold to a casual glance, while actually being hot enough to cause a serious burn on contact. Apprentices learned to treat anything near the forge as potentially hot until they had established otherwise. As the temperature rises above 500 degrees, the red begins to deepen and become visible even in normal light. A dull, dark cherry color that is the first unambiguous visual signal that the metal is genuinely hot. This is sometimes called black red or dark cherry. The iron at this temperature is not workable in the sense that the hammer will effectively reshape it. It is still quite stiff and will resist deformation, and struck too hard it may crack. But it is definitely hot, and it is the beginning of the visible temperature range that the smith actively monitors. Rising through 700 to 800 degrees, the iron moves into what is called cherry red or medium cherry, a warmer, brighter red with some orange in it, visible clearly in both dim and daylight. At this temperature, the iron has begun to soften meaningfully. It is workable in limited ways. It can be bent, and light hammer work can be done on it, but it is still relatively stiff and will require many blows to move significantly. For some fine work, bending small pieces to precise angles, making small adjustments to shape, cherry red is a perfectly useful heat. But for major shaping work, moving significant amounts of metal, the smith typically wants something hotter. Between 900 and 1000 degrees, the color shifts to a bright orange red or light orange, sometimes called orange heat, sometimes simply hot red. This is the working heat for most general forge work. At this temperature, wrought iron has become genuinely plastic, responding well to hammer blows and moving readily under the force of a competent strike. The smith can accomplish significant shaping work in this range, drawing out tapers, spreading material, forming shoulders and profiles. The iron flows with a satisfying responsiveness. This is the bread and butter working range for a medieval smith doing the ordinary tasks of his trade, making agricultural tools, hardware fittings, nails, hinges, hooks, structural iron. Above 1000 degrees, the color brightens further toward a clear, light orange that begins to shade into yellow-orange, sometimes called bright orange or yellow-orange heat. The metal is now very plastic, almost fluid feeling under the hammer, and moves quickly and easily. Work can be accomplished in fewer blows. For heavy forging working large stock, doing rapid initial shaping on a big billet, this temperature is efficient and satisfying. The iron behaves almost generously, accepting the hammer's direction with minimal resistance. Approaching 1200 degrees, the color shifts dramatically into what can only be called yellow-white, a blazing, brilliant color that is almost painful to look at directly, particularly in a dim interior. This is welding heat, the temperature at which two pieces of properly prepared iron pressed firmly together under hammer blows will actually fuse, their surfaces intermingling at the molecular level to form a single piece. Forge welding was a crucial technique in medieval smithing. It was how complex pieces were assembled, how worn tools were repaired, how steel edges were attached to iron bodies in tools like axes and adze's. Achieving and using welding heat required considerable skill, because the margin between the right temperature and destruction was narrow. Iron brought just a few degrees too hot at this stage would begin to burn. You could see it sparkle and throw off bright showers of sparks as the iron oxidized on the surface, and burned iron was ruined iron, brittle and damaged in a way that could not be corrected. Reading these color gradations accurately and acting appropriately at each stage required the smith to develop a calibrated visual system built into his perception through years of practice. But there was a complication that made this more demanding than simply memorizing a color chart. The perceived color of hot iron varies significantly depending on the ambient light conditions in which you are looking at it. In a dim interior, which a medieval smithy typically was, with only small windows and the forge fire itself as light sources, iron appears to glow more brightly than it would in full daylight. A piece of iron that appears to be at orange heat inside the forge might look considerably darker if you carried it outside into bright afternoon sun. The smith who worked in a specific shop, in its specific lighting conditions, at specific times of day, learned to calibrate his color reading to his environment. He was not reading absolute temperature. He was reading temperature as expressed through color in the particular context of his own workplace. This is one of the reasons why the skill of blacksmithing was considered difficult to transfer between individuals and contexts. A smith trained in one shop, with its characteristic light levels and fire characteristics, might find himself momentarily disoriented working in a different shop with different lighting. His color calibrations would need adjustment. This was not a matter of forgetting what he knew. It was the natural consequence of a perceptual skill built up in relation to a specific environment. With time in the new setting, his calibrations would adjust, but there was always a period of recalibration, and experienced smiths understood this and made allowances for it. Beyond the primary color range, the smith was also reading other visual signals from the fire and the metal simultaneously. The behavior of the scale, the iron oxide that forms on the surface of hot iron as it reacts with oxygen in the air, gave information about temperature and surface condition. At lower heats, the scale forms slowly and lies relatively flat on the surface. As temperature increases, the scale becomes more active, forming faster and more loosely, and eventually at high temperatures it becomes liquid and flows as a bright glassy slag that runs off the metal under hammer blows. The behavior of this scale told the smith things about what was happening to his metal that color alone could not convey. The sparks that flew from iron at very high temperatures were also informative, not just as a warning sign of approaching burn temperature, but in their character. Different iron and steel compositions produced different kinds of sparks under the hammer or at the grinding wheel. Wrought iron threw long streaming sparks with few branches. Higher carbon steel produced more complex branching, bursting spark patterns. A skilled smith could judge the carbon content of an unknown piece of iron roughly by observing its spark behavior, a technique that remained in use until quite recently, because it worked and because it required no equipment beyond a grinder and experienced eyes. All of this visual intelligence, the color reading, the scale behavior, the spark observation operated simultaneously, processed by the smith's experienced perception in real time while his hands and body were occupied with the physical work of managing hot metal. It was not a conscious, sequential analysis. First check color, then check scale, then check sparks. It was an integrated sensory awareness, built through years of practice until it operated below the level of deliberate thought. The experienced smith simply knew, by looking at his work in the fire, what temperature it was at, whether it was ready, and what he should do next. The knowledge had moved from his mind into his body, into his eyes, into the fast reflexes of professional perception. This is what the medieval smith meant when he spoke of knowing his craft, not a knowledge carried in books or explained in words, but an embodied knowledge written into perception and muscle and reflex through years of immersion in this particular, demanding, beautiful practice of reading fire and iron by the light of the forge. Segment 4. The Anvil Awaits. If the forge fire was the heart of the medieval smithy, The anvil was its backbone, the fixed, immovable foundation against which all the energy of the hammer was brought to bear, the surface on which iron was persuaded, blow by blow, into the shapes the world needed. Without a good anvil, fire and hammer, and the most skilled hands in the village could accomplish very little. The anvil was not merely a lump of metal to hit things on. It was a precision tool in its own right, designed through centuries of accumulated practical knowledge to present the right surfaces, curves, and angles for the enormous variety of work that passed through a working smith's hands. Understanding the anvil, its parts, its qualities, its proper maintenance and use, was as important to mastering blacksmithing as understanding the fire itself. Medieval anvils differed somewhat in form from the familiar silhouette that most people carry in their heads, the image shaped partly by the later industrial period, partly by the exaggerations of cartoons and illustration. But the fundamental form had been established long before the medieval period and would persist long after. A heavy iron body presenting a flat horizontal working surface with various functional features shaped into or attached to it, all mounted on a stout base that kept it stable under the repeated violent shock of hammer blows. The basic design worked so well because it addressed the fundamental mechanical problem of smithing. You need to strike a piece of hot, soft iron with great force and precision, and you need the energy of that strike to go into reshaping the metal, rather than into bouncing the anvil around, or sending shocks up through the floor. The weight of the anvil was its first important quality. Medieval anvils ranged from perhaps 40 or 50 pounds for small shop or travelling anvils, up to several £100 for large established smithies doing heavy work. The principle was simple. The heavier the anvil, the more of each hammer blow's energy was transferred to the work rather than lost to the anvil moving, vibrating, or bouncing. A light anvil rings and bounces under the hammer. A heavy anvil sits solid and absorbs the blow, concentrating its effect entirely on the metal between hammer and anvil face. Smiths understood this intuitively. The desire was always for as heavy an anvil as could be afforded and accommodated, and in a well-established smithy, the anvil might be the most valuable single object in the building, worth more than the building itself in some cases. The anvil was mounted on a stump, almost universally a section of a large hardwood tree trunk, set upright so that the broad end grain faced upward, and the anvil was fastened to it by iron straps, spikes, or simply by its own weight, sitting in a shaped hollow on the stump's top. The stump served several functions simultaneously. Its mass added to the effective weight of the anvil assembly, increasing the efficiency of energy transfer. Its wood absorbed vibration, acting as a mechanical buffer between the working surface and the earth beneath. A stone or metal base would transmit too much vibration back into the anvil and into the smith's hands and arms, causing fatigue and imprecision. The height of the stump determined the working height of the anvil face, which was critically important for the smith's posture and efficiency. An anvil face at the right height, typically somewhere around waist height, calibrated to the individual smith, allowed the smith to swing his hammer naturally and direct blows with precision or overreaching. An anvil set too low forced the smith into a constant crouch that would destroy his back within an hour. Too high and the hammer could not be swung with proper force. Getting the height right was a basic but important setup consideration, and a smith setting up a new shop would spend time adjusting his stump until the anvil sat exactly where his body worked best. The face of the anvil, its flat horizontal working surface, was its most critical feature and the one most demanding of quality. The hardness and flatness of the face determined the quality of work that could be produced on it. A good anvil face was made of hard iron or steel, harder than the material being worked on it, which sounds obvious but was not simple to achieve in the medieval period, when the metallurgy of producing consistently hard, tough iron was still developing. The face had to be hard enough to resist being marked by hammer blows landing on it directly, which happened when doing edge work or when the hammer slipped off the workpiece, but not so hard that it was brittle and liable to crack or chip. It needed to be flat enough that work done on it would be flat. A significantly dished or warped anvil face introduced curvature into everything worked on it, and it needed to be smooth, because surface texture transferred to the work. A rough or pitted anvil face left corresponding marks on soft hot iron. Maintaining the face in good condition was therefore an ongoing concern. The edges of the anvil face, the corners where the face met the sides of the body, were particularly important. A sharp, crisp edge was useful for some work but dangerous for others. Bending iron sharply over a hard corner could introduce stress concentrations that led to cracks in the finished piece. Most anvils had edges that varied around the perimeter, one side with a crisper edge for cutting and bending work, the other side with a slightly rounded profile for work where a sharp corner would be harmful. The smith learned to orient his work on the anvil accordingly, using the right part of the edge for the job at hand. The horn, the tapered conical projection extending from one end of the anvil body, was the feature most immediately distinctive about the blacksmith's anvil compared to any other heavy working surface. The horn's curve allowed the smith to work curves and rings into iron. A bar bent over the horn would follow the horn's contour, and by moving the bar along the horn from base to tip, the smith could achieve different radii of curvature. Need a large ring work nearer the base where the horn is thick and the curve is gentle. Need a small tight hook work at the tip where the horn is narrow and the curve sharp. The horn was also used for drawing out tapers and for forming chain links, eye bolts, staples, and a whole range of other curved or ring-like features that appeared in the smith's everyday work. A world built from iron hardware depended on an enormous variety of bent, curved, and looped forms, and the horn made these achievable efficiently. Most medieval anvils also had one or more holes in or near the face, a square hole called the hardy hole, and often a round hole called the pritchel hole. The hardy hole accepted the square shanks of bottom tools, tools designed to be inserted into the anvil and used in conjunction with hammerwork on the piece above them. A hardy, for instance, is a chisel mounted, pointing upward in the hardy hole. The smith placed hot iron over it and struck the iron above the hardy to cut through it from below, cleanly and without the difficulty of holding a chisel in one hand while hammering with the other. Fullers, swages, and other bottom tools worked the same way, each creating a specific effect in the iron above them. The pritchel hole was primarily for punching. When driving a punch through hot iron to create a hole, the punch needed somewhere to go when it broke through, and the pritchel hole provided that clearance so the punch could be driven fully through the metal without being stopped by the anvil face. The condition of the anvil surface was something every smith assessed regularly, not with instruments, but with the sensitive palm of the hand, run across the face to feel for roughness, new nicks, or developing pits that might affect work quality. A crack developing in the face was a serious concern. An anvil with a cracked face would ring differently under the hammer, and left unaddressed, the crack could propagate and eventually destroy the tool. Major repairs to a cracked or seriously damaged anvil required forge welding new material onto the face, a sophisticated and demanding process that was beyond the average village smith and typically required a specialist. The cost of a new anvil, or a major repair, was significant enough that smiths treated their anvils with considerable respect and took care not to abuse them through careless work. There was also a tradition, in many smithing cultures, of something close to emotional relationship with the anvil, not mystical or superstitious in the modern condescending sense of those words, but the natural affective bond that develops between a skilled worker and a central tool used intimately for many years. The smith, who inherited his father's anvil, or who had worked the same tool for 30 years, knew it with a thoroughness that went beyond technical familiarity. He knew its particular ring, the way it absorbed or returned energy, the specific areas of its face where work behaved best. Every anvil has an individual character, shaped by the specifics of its manufacture and by the history of use written into it over the years. An experienced smith, working a familiar anvil, was working in a relationship of deep mutual knowledge. He knew the tool, and the tool, in some real mechanical sense, knew him. The ring of the anvil, that clear metallic note that sounds out with each hammer blow in a working smithy, was itself informative. A good anvil rings clearly and sustains the note. An anvil with a crack, or one sitting badly on its stump with poor contact, gives a dead, flat sound. The ring told the smith about the energy transfer in each blow. A clear ring on a correctly struck piece of hot iron at working heat sounded and felt different from a dead thud on cold iron, or the sharp crack of a misstruck blow landing partly on the anvil face. The acoustics of the work were part of the smith's awareness, feeding information about what was happening in the same way that vision and touch did. The anvil, therefore, was not passive. It was not merely the surface the hammer hit against. It was an active participant in the work, contributing its hardness, its shape, its specific features, its accumulated history and condition to every piece that passed through the shop. It waited, heavy and still, at the center of the smithy, but its waiting was not emptiness. It was readiness, the readiness of a well-made tool for the work it was designed to do. Segment 5. Pulling the iron. There is a moment in every heat, every single time a piece of iron is pulled from the forge, that is in some ways the most critical moment in the entire sequence of blacksmithing. It is not the moment of the first hammer blow, though that matters enormously. It is not the moment of final shaping or quench. It is the moment of transition, when the smith, reading the color of the buried metal through the coals, judges that the iron has reached the right temperature, grips it with the tongs, and pulls it free from the fire. That moment sets the terms for everything that follows. Come too soon, before the iron is fully at heat, and the work will be sluggish, difficult, requiring far more blows than it should, and risking cracking the metal by working it below a safe temperature. Come too late, a few seconds, sometimes, and the iron may have crossed over into territory where it is dangerously close to burning, where the surface oxidizes rapidly, and the quality of the metal is compromised. The decision to pull the iron is made constantly, tens or hundreds of times a day, and it never becomes trivial. The mechanics of how this moment played out were shaped by the tools involved. Tongs were the interface between the smith's hands and the hot metal, the means by which something at 1000 degrees Celsius could be held and controlled and positioned precisely by a human being. Medieval smiths used tongs in enormous variety: flat-jawed tongs for gripping flat stock, rounded jaw or bolt tongs for round bar, pickup tongs with a bent geometry for lifting and carrying pieces flat rather than vertical, scrolling tongs, chain tongs, box jaw tongs for square stock. The variety reflected the diversity of work the smith encountered. A single jaw type cannot grip all shapes securely. An insecure grip of hot iron is one of the more immediate ways a day in the smithy becomes dangerous. A piece of iron at welding heat that slips from poorly fitted tongs doesn't fall politely to the floor. It tumbles in unpredictable directions, throwing scale and potentially landing on the smith's foot, or the apprentice's arm, or in a pile of dry wood shavings. Making good tong grip was therefore a prerequisite skill. The smith learned to fit his tongs to the specific stock he was working with. If gripping a round bar, the tong jaws needed to be shaped to contact the curve of the bar evenly around its arc, rather than touching only at 2 points, which would allow rocking and slippage. If gripping a flat bar, the jaws needed to be set at the right width for that bar's thickness. This fitting was not necessarily done for every individual piece every time, but experienced smiths had a range of tongs, each fitted to a common stock size, and they selected accordingly at the start of each job. An apprentice who brought the wrong tongs and had to be sent back to get the right ones while the iron cooled was an apprentice who had not been paying attention and would hear about it. With the right tongs in hand and the iron at heat, the physical act of pulling the iron was swift and practiced. The smith reached into the fire with the tongs, positioned the jaws around the piece by feel and brief visual check. The light inside the fire made it harder to see clearly and closed the grip. Then a single smooth pull, bringing the piece out of the coals and upright, turning it naturally to a vertical or angled position that let him assess the heat quickly with a glance. That glance was economical. He was not studying the color in detail, because he had been monitoring it through the coals for the last minute or two. He was confirming, yes, this is at the heat I expected, or noticing that it was slightly hotter or cooler than intended, and adjusting his plan accordingly. The movement from fire to anvil was not a run. Medieval smithing manuals and the accumulated testimony of practicing smiths across many centuries agree: you don't run. Running with hot iron is dangerous. It increases the chance of a stumble, a collision, a piece dropping, and it is also unnecessary, because the iron does not cool as fast as the urgency of the moment might make a novice believe. Walking swiftly and purposefully from hearth to anvil, a distance of perhaps 4 to 6 feet in a well-organized shop, consumed perhaps 2 to 3 seconds. The iron, brought out at a good working heat of 900 to 1100 degrees, would remain workable for somewhere between 30 seconds and 2 minutes, depending on its mass, shape, and the ambient temperature. Thin pieces cooled faster, heavy billets cooled more slowly. Part of the smith's calculation when designing the sequence of work was understanding how long each heat would remain viable, and planning the series of blows he intended to deliver within that window. That window was finite and unforgiving. As the iron cooled from working heat down through the color spectrum, orange to red to dark red to black, its workability decreased rapidly. The point at which it became inadvisable to continue hammering was not merely about the effort required, though a cooling piece did increasingly resist the hammer. More critically, it was about the risk of damaging the iron. Wrought iron hammered when it has cooled below roughly 700 degrees, below a proper red heat, becomes prone to cracking. The internal structure of the metal, which is accommodating and plastic at high temperatures, begins to harden and become less ductile, and the compressive and shear forces of hammer blows can open small cracks, particularly at the edges of the piece. Once a crack appears in iron, it tends to propagate on subsequent heats. The smith's task was to get his work done within the available window and return the piece to the fire before it reached the dangerous cool zone. This created a rhythm, heat, work, that structured the entire day. The smith was always aware of where he was in the cooling curve of the current piece, always monitoring the color of the metal in his tongs with the peripheral awareness of an expert practitioner, always making decisions about whether he had time for one more blow, one more shaping move, before it was time to go back to the fire. This awareness was not anxious or stressful in an experienced smith. It was simply the background tempo of the work, as natural and automatic as the way a musician monitors the beat. But it was also a discipline. There was a constant temptation, when a piece was nearly finished or when a critical shaping move was almost achieved, to push a little further, to take a few more blows on metal that had already cooled past the ideal working range. The experienced smith resisted this temptation, knowing that the cost of a cracked piece or a rough cold-worked surface was higher than the cost of another trip to the fire. The tongs themselves, as the smith carried the iron from fire to anvil, had to maintain a grip that was firm but not rigid. The iron needed to be held securely enough that it couldn't swing or fall, but the grip couldn't be so constraining that the smith couldn't rotate or reposition the piece quickly between blows. Much of the real skill of hammerwork lay in the coordinated action of tong hand and hammer hand. While the hammer hand delivered strikes, the tong hand was constantly repositioning the work, rotating the bar to expose a new face, shifting it forward or back along the anvil, presenting a different angle to the hammer. These repositioning movements had to be fast. Each one consumed time from the cooling window, and they had to be precise, because the blow that followed a repositioning movement was directed based on where the tong hand had placed the work. Tong hand and hammer hand functioned as a coordinated system, each compensating for the other's movements, maintaining a continuous adjustment of work angle and position while the hammering proceeded. For heavier pieces, large agricultural tools, structural components, heavy hammerheads, the smith might use a striker, an assistant or senior apprentice, who wielded a large sledgehammer on the smith's signal. The smith, holding the work with tongs and directing the action with a smaller hammer held in his striking hand, would indicate by the placement and angle of his own light blows where the striker should direct the sledgehammer. The communication was often entirely non-verbal. A tap of the hand hammer on the anvil face indicated the target point for the next sledgehammer blow. A tilt of the tongs rotated the work for the next strike. Working with a striker required a precise mutual understanding and considerable trust. The striker was swinging a very large, very heavy hammer in close proximity to the smith's hands and the workpiece, and a mistimed or misdirected blow could be catastrophic. Good striker-smith pairs developed over time an almost telepathic efficiency, working at a speed and precision together that neither could achieve alone. After the hammer work of each heat was accomplished, or when the color told him he was approaching the end of the workable window, the smith returned the piece to the fire, burying it again in the coals, with a precise motion that placed the working section in the hottest part of the bed. Then he evaluated his progress. What shape had been achieved? What remained to do? Was the iron responding as expected, or had something, an inclusion in the material, an unexpected thickness, changed the behavior? Had he made the progress he intended in this heat? If not, what would he do differently in the next one? This evaluation happened in the seconds, while the iron was back in the fire, heating again. The experienced smith used this time actively, not waiting passively but thinking forward, planning the next heat sequence of blows, deciding whether a change of tool or technique was needed, perhaps adjusting the tong fit or moving to a different part of the anvil. By the time the iron reached working heat again, the plan for the next heat was already formed. The transition from fire to anvil was then not a response to the ready metal, but the execution of a plan already made, swift, purposeful, efficient, pulling the iron, again and again, dozens of times in a single working day. The smith accumulated a physical knowledge of each piece he worked on that went beyond what any description or drawing could convey. He knew the weight of it in the tongs, the way it balanced, the way it had been responding to the hammer over the heats already completed. He knew where it was thin and where it was thick, where it had moved as intended and where it had been stubborn. Each time he pulled it from the fire and carried it the few steps to the anvil, He was returning to a conversation already in progress, a negotiation, conducted in fire and iron and hammer blows, between the smith's intention and the material's nature. Segment 6. The language of the hammer. To watch a skilled medieval blacksmith at the anvil was to watch something that looked, from a distance, like pure physical labor, a man swinging a heavy tool repeatedly at a piece of metal. But to watch more closely, or to understand what you were seeing, was to realize that this appearance was entirely misleading. Smithing was not the application of force to material. It was a conversation, and the hammer was its medium of expression. Every blow was a word in a vocabulary of force and direction and timing that had taken years to learn, and the iron, hot and responsive on the anvil, was both the page on which the conversation was written and an active participant in it, responding to each strike in ways the smith anticipated and in ways that required constant adjustment. The language of the hammer was as nuanced, as demanding, and as endlessly deep as any other language, and a master smith who had spent 30 years perfecting it was as sophisticated a communicator in his medium as a poet in communicator, in his medium as a poet in his medium as a poet, in a semidium as a poet and with words, in a supplementive word, in a senth, in a sepeneg, as a ginas, bellativan with the pepis a gimme pensa witsmin with a we're sad appa with about process as like back up at whip back happens up with a alga up mega hap god wafakma afsaka with ask a suffect they've got it a pet that rest with this could because bev westmid that's with the best the hammer itself, the basic striking tool that all of this rested on, existed in many forms in a medieval smithy, and the smith's choice of hammer for a particular task was not arbitrary. The two most fundamental types were the hand hammer, held in the striking hand and used by the smith alone to direct the work with precision, and the sledgehammer or forehammer, used by a striker or swung two-handed by the smith himself for heavy initial work. The hand hammer typically weighed between 1 and 3 pounds, light enough to be swung repeatedly for hours with precision, heavy enough to move hot iron meaningfully. The sledgehammer could weigh 8, 10, 12 pounds or more, useful for the heavy work of initial shaping but too unwieldy for the fine directed work that brought a piece to its finished form. Within the category of hand hammers, the variety was considerable. The cross-peen hammer had a striking face on one side and a wedge-shaped peen, typically oriented across the hammer's axis on the other. The peen was used for specific shaping tasks. Striking with the cross-peen could spread and elongate metal in a controlled direction, useful for drawing out tapers, creating decorative textures, or working in tight places where the full face of the hammer couldn't be presented to the work. The straight peen or long peen hammer had its wedge running along the hammer's axis rather than across it, creating different directional spreading. Ball peen hammers had a rounded peen useful for riveting and for working curves into sheet material. The smith accumulated these variants over years, acquiring or making tools that addressed specific recurring needs in his work, until the rack of hammers on his wall represented a vocabulary of striking possibilities adapted to the full range of his practice. The quality of a hammer's handle, its haft, was as important as the quality of the head. A haft that was too short gave the smith insufficient mechanical advantage and placed his hand too close to the work. Too long and it became unwieldy, harder to control precisely. The wood of the haft mattered too. It needed to be hard and dense enough to withstand the shock of repeated blows without splitting, but with some degree of elasticity to absorb and buffer vibration rather than transmitting all of it directly to the smith's hand and wrist. Ash was a common choice in medieval Europe, prized for exactly this combination of strength and shock absorption. The fit between head and haft was critical. A loose head was dangerous, likely to fly off unpredictably, and was a source of anxiety and distraction for the smith that he could not afford. Smiths checked their hammer hafts regularly, tightening wedges and replacing damaged hafts as necessary. The way a smith held his hammer was itself a matter of refined technique developed over years. For heavy striking work, the initial forging of a large piece, the fast movement of a lot of material, the smith gripped the hammer near the end of the haft, maximizing the mechanical advantage of the full length and driving the heaviest possible blows. For precision work, fine shaping, working detail, finishing the grip move toward the middle or even toward the head, shortening the effective lever arm and sacrificing power for control. This adjustment was constant throughout a heat, moving fluidly between heavier and lighter striking as the work demanded, the grip position shifting on the haft in a continuous subtle adaptation that an experienced smith performed without conscious thought. The angle at which the hammer face met the work was perhaps the most fundamental variable in the SHL's control vocabulary. A flat blow hammer face parallel to the anvil face drove the metal straight down, thickening it if it had nowhere to go, and spreading it equally in all directions if struck on a free end. This blow was used to consolidate and compress metal. An angled blow, hammer face tilted forward, drove metal preferentially in one direction, pushing it away from the smith. An angled blow in the other direction drove it toward him. Left and right tilt spread material to the sides. The precise angle of each blow, varied by subtle rotation of the wrist as the hammer descended, directed the flow of hot plastic iron with extraordinary precision in the hands of a skilled smith. He was not merely hitting the iron, he was directing it, sculpting its flow the way a woodcarver directs the grain of the material with each chisel cut. The position of the work on the anvil controlled what happened to the iron that had nowhere to go under hammer pressure. Iron stuck to the anvil face was forced outward and upward. Iron overhanging the edge of the anvil could be pushed downward around the edge, creating a bend or a shoulder. By controlling how much of the piece was supported on the anvil face and how much hung over the edge or the horn, the smith controlled the direction in which material moved under his blows. This control of overhang was one of the most important spatial skills in smithing, and it was managed entirely by the tong hand, which positioned and repositioned the work between every blow in a continuous adjustment. Drawing out the most fundamental of all blacksmithing operations, producing a taper or elongation by reducing cross-section, was a masterclass in this control of direction and force. To draw a bar to a point, the smith began working the bar against the anvil, using angled blows to direct metal away from the tip, rotating the bar a quarter turn between groups of blows to work it evenly on all four sides. If you worked it consistently at a quarter turn, the bar drew out square in cross-section. If you varied the rotation, it drew out in a different profile. By controlling the angle of his blows and the rotation of the work, he could produce tapers that were square, round, diamond, rectangular, or any intermediate form. A well-drawn taper was smooth and even, without the lumps and steps that betrayed a novice's uneven striking, and achieving it required a command of hammer angle and work rotation that seemed simple to describe and was ferociously difficult to execute well. Upsetting, the opposite of drawing, thickening and widening a bar by compression, required a different technique. The bar was oriented vertically on the anvil face and struck on its end, driving the material to spread outward at the bottom. Controlling how the metal spread was the challenge. Without careful technique, it spread unevenly, creating a mushroomed end that was thick on one side and thin on another. The smith controlled the spread by the exact centering of each blow and by the use of the anvil horn or the flat face to dress the thickened section back toward symmetry between the upward compressions. Upsetting was used to create heads on bolts and nails, to build up material for a boss or flange, or to add mass to a specific part of a piece before further shaping. Bending was straightforward in concept, heating the iron and forming it over the horn or the anvil edge, but demanded precision in execution. The exact temperature at which bending happened determined the character of the bend. Very hot metal bent smoothly and easily, but the precision of the angle was harder to control because the material was so fluid. Cooler metal required more force, but allowed a crisper, more controlled angle. Smiths learned to bend at a temperature suited to the specific requirement. Fluid heat for large curves and coils, stiffer heat for tight, precise angles. The horn's curve offered a range of radii from base to tip, and by choosing the working position on the horn, the smith selected the curvature he wanted. Bending over the anvil edge produced sharper bends and allowed the smith to set an angle precisely by hammering the work flat on the face after the initial bend had been formed. All of these operations, drawing, upsetting, bending, shouldering, fullering, swagging, combined in sequences that the experienced smith planned ahead, working through a mental model of the finished piece and working backward through the operations required to reach it. A plough coulter, for instance, required a specific sequence. Upset, to create mass in one section, draw to taper the body, shoulder to define the geometry, then fuller and swage to shape the curved working edge. Working in the wrong sequence meant producing intermediate shapes that couldn't easily be corrected, wasting heats and material. Planning the sequence correctly meant each heat's work left the piece closer to the intended form, with each operation building naturally on the last. The rhythm of the hammer in a working heat had a quality beyond pure mechanics. In a good heat, material at the right temperature, the work proceeding as planned, the blows landing where intended, with the effect intended, there was a fluency to the striking that experienced smiths recognized and valued. The hammer swings settled into a tempo, the tongue hand moved in precise coordination, the iron moved as it should. The ringing of the anvil changed character as the iron thinned and hardened. The feel of each blow through the haft communicated the condition of the material. The color of the metal told the smith how much time remained. All of this information arrived simultaneously and was processed by the integrated sensory motor system of a skilled body operating within its competence. In those moments, the hammer was not a tool separate from the smith. It was an extension of his will, translating intention directly into iron, its language spoken fluently and without translation. Segment 7. Back to the fire, again and again. There is a temptation, when imagining the medieval blacksmith at work, to picture a single dramatic sequence: iron plunged into fire, drawn out, glowing, beaten into shape in one sustained burst of effort, then held up complete and finished against the light. It is a compelling image, and it is almost entirely wrong. The reality of forge work, the reality that every apprentice discovered within his first week at the hearth, and that never changed, no matter how many decades of experience accumulated, was repetition, cycling, the iron going back into the fire, again and again and again, until the work was done. Not because the smith had failed or been too slow, but because the nature of iron at heat demanded it. The fire was not a one-time preparation for the work. It was a constant partner in it, called upon over and over throughout the making of every single piece, however simple or complex. Understanding this cycle, its necessity, its rhythm, its management, was to understand the fundamental structure of the blacksmith's day. The reason for the repeated return to the fire was simple and physical. Hot iron is workable, cooling iron is not, or rather, it becomes progressively less workable and progressively more liable to damage as its temperature falls. A piece drawn from the fire at a good working heat of around 1000 degrees had a window of perhaps 30 seconds to 2 minutes, depending on its mass and geometry, before it cooled past the point where further hammer work was advisable. In that window, the smith could accomplish a defined amount of shaping. When the window closed, the piece went back into the fire. The coals were stoked, the bellows were pumped, and the cycle began again. Simple tools required a handful of heats. Complex pieces with many features, a plough coulter with a shaped working edge and a specific fitting geometry, a large hinge with multiple leaves and a tight-fitting barrel, a hammerhead with a properly drifted eye and dressed faces might require 20, 30, 50 heats or more before they were finished. Each heat was therefore a unit of work, a discrete episode in the making of the piece, with a defined start and a defined end, and a specific set of operations that the smith planned to accomplish within it. Planning the sequence of heats was itself a skill. Some operations needed to be done early in the process, when the piece still had the mass and cross-section to support aggressive hammerwork without collapsing or distorting in unintended ways. Others needed to wait until the piece had been brought closer to its final form, when the finer shaping and dressing work could be done with more precision and lighter blows. Doing operations in the wrong order, trying to dress and refine a surface that had not yet been fully shaped, for instance, or attempting to work fine detail on a piece that was still too heavy and would have its careful work obliterated in subsequent heavy heats, was the mark of an inexperienced or poorly trained smith. The master thought ahead, always, planning not just the current heat but the whole arc of heats required to take raw iron to finished tool. Between heats, the period while the iron was back in the fire building up the temperature again, the shop did not go quiet. This time was not downtime. It was preparation time, and a well-organized smithy used it fully. The smith might check the temperature of the fire and adjust the fuel level, adding charcoal if needed to ensure the next heat would be at full temperature without waiting. He might examine the piece, just returned to the fire, and assess the progress made in the last heat. Was the taper coming out as intended? Was there a slight twist developing that needed correction? Was the metal responding as expected? Or had an inclusion or uneven section of the original stock complicated the process? He might consult a mental image of the finished piece and check it against where the current work stood, revising his plan for subsequent heats if the progress had been faster or slower than anticipated. He might also use the time between heats to do other small tasks that did not require heat, dressing his tools, reshaping a hammer face that had developed a chip, adjusting the fit of a pair of tongs, sweeping scale from around the anvil. A working smithy was never idle. Every gap was filled with something purposeful, and the management of time within the rhythm of the fire was itself an expression of the smith's organization and discipline. An inefficient smith spent his between heat time standing and waiting, watching the fire without using the minutes, while an efficient smith was always one step ahead of the fire, ready for the next heat before it arrived, using every available interval for productive preparation. The apprentice's role in managing this rhythm was critical. In a smithy with a master and one or more apprentices, the apprentice's primary function was to keep the fire correct, so that there was never a wait for heat. When the smith returned a piece to the fire, the apprentice pumped the bellows at the rate needed to build the coals back to full temperature for the next heat. He monitored the fuel level and added charcoal in the small, careful increments that maintained the fire without smothering it. He ensured the quench barrel was full, that tools were back in their places after being used, that the floor around the anvil was clear of scale that might cause a slip. All of this support work freed the master to focus entirely on the shaping work itself, and the quality of that support, how quickly and cleanly the apprentice kept the fire, how well he anticipated what would be needed, could make a meaningful difference to the pace and quality of the day's output. In a shop with multiple apprentices or journeymen, the rhythm could become more complex and more efficient simultaneously. While one piece was in the fire heating, the smith might work a second piece at the anvil that was already at heat. When that second piece needed to go back, the first might be ready to come out. In the most productive and well-staffed medieval smithies, this kind of overlapping cycle, multiple pieces in rotation, through the fire and the anvil, meant that the anvil was almost never standing idle, the smith almost never waiting for heat, and the output of finished work per day was substantially higher than a single smith, single-piece operation could achieve. Achieving this kind of productive overlap required careful planning, clear communication with assistants, and a spatial and temporal awareness that tracked multiple pieces in multiple stages simultaneously, a demanding cognitive load layered on top of the physical demands of the work itself. The forge fire itself changed character over the course of a long working day, and managing those changes was an ongoing task. Fresh charcoal burned brightly and hotly, but produced a somewhat irregular heat until it settled. As the working day progressed and the coal bed matured, the charcoal burning down to a consistent, evenly packed bed of glowing carbon, the fire often reached its best and most steady performance in the middle of the day. The smith learned to recognize this mature fire and to use its consistency as a tool, knowing that temperature was more predictable and controllable when the fire was well established than when it had just been built up, or when it was burning too low and needed significant fuel addition. Toward the end of a long day, the fire might need more active management, as fuel burned down faster than earlier and the coal bed became shallower and less consistent. The physical experience of the repeated cycle, fire, anvil, fire, anvil, was one of the defining features of a smith's body over time. The constant movement between the hot zone of the hearth and the working zone of the anvil, the alternation between the heat of the fire on the face and forearms and the comparative coolness of the rest of the shop, created a pattern of thermal exposure that was unique to this occupation. Smiths were often recognizable by the particular character of the burn marks and heat damage on their forearms and the backs of their hands, the result of years of working with hot metal, reaching into fires, carrying glowing iron through air. The faces of experienced smiths often showed the characteristic weathering of prolonged exposure to radiated heat, a kind of permanent deep ruddiness, a slight coarsening of the skin that came from standing in front of a hot forge for thousands of hours over a working lifetime. The sound of the shop changed with the cycle too, in ways that any regular visitor would have learned to read. When the iron was in the fire, the dominant sound was the bellows, the rhythmic rush of air, the crackle and roar of the coals. When the iron came to the anvil, the clear ringing of hammer on work and hammer on iron replaced it. The transition from one sound to the other and back again was the heartbeat of the shop. Its fundamental rhythm, repeated continuously from the first hour of the working day to the last. Visitors to medieval smithies noted the sound it carried far, the ringing of anvils being one of the characteristic auditory signatures of a working village, and those who worked in them internalized it so completely that they later described the silence of a smithy where the fire had gone cold as something almost physical, a wrong absence. The management of the fire between heats also required attention to a subtler concern: the effect of the fire's atmosphere on the iron being heated. A forge fire burning with an excess of air relative to fuel, an oxidizing atmosphere would cause rapid scaling on the surface of the iron, removing material and potentially introducing surface defects. A fire burning rich in fuel relative to air, a reducing atmosphere, could actually protect the surface of the iron to some degree, allowing clean heats with less scale loss. Sophisticated smiths understood this and managed their bellows operation to maintain a slightly fuel-rich fire, particularly for fine work where surface quality mattered. This meant not pumping too hard or too fast enough air to maintain temperature, but not so much that the fire burned excessively oxidizing. It was a fine balance, maintained by experience rather than measurement, and it was one of the details that separated the work of a master from that of a merely competent craftsman. When particularly long or complex pieces were being made, large agricultural tools, structural ironwork for buildings, heavy items of equipment, the number of heats required could extend a single item's fabrication over multiple working days. The smith would bring the piece to a certain stage of completion, return it to the stock or lay it aside, and come back to it the next morning or the next week when other pressing work had been cleared. Managing multiple pieces in various stages of completion, knowing exactly where each one was in its sequence of heats, what needed to happen next to each one, which pieces were most urgent, was the organizational challenge of the busy medieval smithy. The smith, who could hold all of this in his head, move fluidly between jobs as the fire's demands and the day's priorities dictated, and produce finished work consistently and on time, was a genuinely skilled manager as well as a skilled craftsman. All of this, the repeated cycling, the planning of heats, the management of multiple pieces, the keeping of the fire, the use of between heat time, constituted what might be called the invisible skill of blacksmithing, the organizational and temporal intelligence that surrounded and supported the visible dramatic work of hammer and iron. Observers saw the striking, the sparks, the glowing metal. They did not see the planning, the sequencing, the continuous adjustments of fire management that made the striking possible. But the masters of the craft knew that these invisible skills were as important as the visible ones, and that the smith, who could not manage the rhythm of his fire and his work with the same competence he brought to the anvil, would never achieve the productivity and quality that true mastery demanded. Segment 8. Shaping common tools. The popular imagination of the medieval blacksmith tends toward the dramatic, swords gleaming from the quench, armor being beaten into shape piece by piece, blades for knights and weapons for war. These things were made, certainly, and they required skill of the highest order, but they were not the daily bread of the ordinary village smithy. The overwhelming majority of work that passed through the average medieval blacksmith's forge, week after week, season after season, year after year, was far less glamorous and far more essential. Ploughshares and plough fittings, scythes and sickles, axes and hatchets, hammers, chisels, door hinges and latches, nails by the thousands, horseshoes and horse furniture, hooks and brackets and straps and staples and rings. The iron hardware of everyday agricultural and domestic life, worn out and broken by hard daily use, and needing constant repair and replacement. This was the real work of the village smith, and it was from this work, competent, efficient, and ceaseless, that medieval civilization derived much of its practical capability. The ploughshare was perhaps the single most important tool the medieval blacksmith produced. It was the cutting edge of the plough, the iron element that bit into the soil and turned it, and the entire agricultural productivity of a medieval village depended on ploughs functioning reliably through the critical seasons of ploughing. A ploughshare that broke or wore out at the wrong moment, in the middle of the autumn ploughing, when the ground needed to be turned before the first hard frosts, could mean fields left unplanted and a community facing hunger the following year. The blacksmith, who could make and repair ploughshares efficiently and well, was not providing a service of convenience. He was providing a service on which lives depended. Making a ploughshare required a specific understanding of both form and function. The share had to have a broad, flat body tapering to a working edge that was sharp enough to cut soil cleanly but not so thin that it wore away or chipped quickly. It had to be strong through its body to resist the considerable mechanical forces of being dragged through soil, forces that included not just the pulling force of the oxen or horses, but the sudden shock loads of striking buried stones, which could be enormous, and it had to be made in a consistent geometry that allowed it to be fitted correctly to the plough body. since a share set at the wrong angle would not plough correctly, regardless of how well it was made as an individual piece of ironwork. The process of making a ploughshare began with selecting appropriate stock, a piece of wrought iron of sufficient weight and section to provide the material for the finished share without excessive waste. The smith would heat the iron and begin the fundamental operations of drawing and spreading, elongating and widening the bar through directed hammerwork over many heats until the rough geometry of the share began to emerge. The broad flat body was formed by spreading the material laterally, using hammer blows angled to push metal outward from the central line, while maintaining a reasonable thickness through the body for strength. The taper to the cutting edge was achieved by progressive drawing work on the leading section, working the edge thinner and longer with controlled blows over several heats. The cutting edge itself presented a specific metallurgical challenge that the skilled smith addressed by a technique known as steeling or edge welding. Ordinary wrought iron, while tough and ductile, does not hold a cutting edge well. It is too soft to resist the abrasion of soil and the wear of daily use. A ploughshare made entirely of wrought iron would require resharpening and replacement far too often to be practical. The answer was to weld a piece of higher carbon steel onto the working edge of the wrought iron body, creating a composite tool with a tough iron core and a hard edge-retaining steel face. This forge welding operation, bringing both pieces to welding heat simultaneously and pressing them together under rapid hammer blows to fuse the surfaces, was one of the most demanding operations in the smith's repertoire, requiring precise temperature management of two different materials at once and a flawless technique at the welding moment. Done well, the result was a working edge that stayed sharp through extended use and could be reground and resharpened many times before the steel layer was worn away. The scythe and the sickle were the harvest tools, the iron edges that cut grain and grass through the long days of the medieval harvest season. Both were long curved blades requiring a very specific combination of properties: a thin, sharp cutting edge capable of slicing through plant stems cleanly, a body with enough stiffness to maintain the blade's form under the sweeping force of use, and a geometry that allowed the curved cutting edge to present correctly to the material being cut at each point in the swing. Making a scythe blade was a test of the smith's ability to work thin section material. The blade had to be drawn out thin enough to cut well without being so thin that it cracked or buckled, and to maintain a consistent curve through the whole length of the blade during the shaping process. The curvature was formed progressively, using the horn and the anvil edge in combination, with careful attention to keeping the curve even and the blade flat rather than twisted. Axes and hatchets were among the most common tools in medieval everyday life, used for wood splitting, felling, carpentry, and general heavy cutting work. Their manufacture involved one of the blacksmith's most characteristic structural techniques, the wrapped eye, rather than forging the axe head as a single solid piece with a hole punched through it. The smith typically formed the axe head by wrapping the body around a mandrel to create the eye, the socket through which the handle would pass, and then welding the body of the axe closed below the eye. This technique produced an eye that was naturally aligned with the axe head's geometry and allowed the handle to be fitted securely with a wedge. The cutting edge of the axe, like the ploughshare's working edge, was typically steeled, a piece of high-carbon steel welded onto the face of the wrought iron body to provide a hardening edge that would take and hold a keen cutting bevel. Nails deserve particular mention because they were produced in staggering quantities in any busy medieval smithy, and because their production repetitive, fast, requiring consistent technique across hundreds of identical small operations. Illustrated. A very different aspect of the smith's skill than the complex individual pieces. Nails were made from rodstock drawn down to an appropriate cross-section, and then cut and headed in a rapid sequence. Heat the tip of the rod to bright orange, drive it into a nail header, a hardy tool with a tapered hole that supported the rod just below where the head would be formed. Cut the rod to length with a hardy cutter, and quickly hammer the protruding end into a head while the metal was still hot. A good smith doing nail work could produce dozens of nails per hour, working in a fast, almost automatic rhythm that used the minimum of heats and the minimum of motion to produce consistent results. The nail work was the sprint running of blacksmithing, high speed, repetitive, demanding its own kind of skilled automaticity rather than the deliberate judgment required for complex individual pieces. Horseshoes were another staple of the village smithy's output, and in a society where horses were the primary means of transportation and a significant source of agricultural traction, the demand for horseshoes was continuous and large. A working horse needed its shoes replaced regularly, every 4 to 6 weeks under heavy use, and a village that relied on several horses and draft. Animals needed a reliable supply of correctly fitted shoes at all times. Making a horseshoe was a relatively quick operation for an experienced smith. Bar stock was heated, worked to the correct width and profile, curved to the rough shape of the shoe over the horn. The nail holes punched with a pritchel while the iron was at heat, and the shoe dressed to its final shape and fit. The fitting of the shoe to the horse, heating the finished shoe and pressing it momentarily to the hoof to mark the fit, then adjusting as needed before final nailing, required its own knowledge that intersected smithing with farriery, and in many small villages the blacksmith also served this function. The door hinge, the simple object that every household depended on for the most fundamental privacy and security, was in the medieval period an iron object made by the blacksmith and expected to last for decades, sometimes generations. Medieval hinges were robust, heavily made things compared to their modern equivalents, designed for wooden doors that might be very heavy and exposed to weather and rough daily use. Their manufacture required the smithing of long strap sections, the forming of the barrel knuckle around which the two leaves pivoted, and the punching of nail holes at appropriate intervals along the straps. The knuckle or barrel, the cylindrical joint that allowed the two leaves to rotate relative to each other, was formed by wrapping hot iron around a mandrel and welding or forging it closed. A small but precise operation that had to produce a barrel both strong enough to resist the leverage of a heavy door and smooth enough to allow the hinge to swing freely without binding. Chains were produced in medieval smithies for a great range of applications, securing livestock, suspending cauldrons over fires, as part of equipment for wells and drawbridges, in the rigging of ships, as security hardware for doors and gates. Each link in a chain was an individual forged piece, a piece of rodstock bent into an oval loop with its ends forge welded together, then interlocked with the previous link before the weld was made. Chain making was tedious, cumulative work. Each link took only a minute or two, but a length of useful chain required many links and many small precision welds. The quality of those welds determined the strength of the chain, and a chain was only as strong as its weakest link in the most literal possible sense. A chain with one badly made weld that failed under load was useless, and the smith who made it unreliable. Quality in chain making was therefore a matter of consistency across dozens or hundreds of small operations, maintaining the same attention and technique for the 100th link as for the first. Throughout all of this common work, the ploughshares, the nails, the hinges, the horseshoes, the chains, the smith operated within a web of relationships and obligations that shaped his work as much as any technical consideration. He knew the people who used his tools. He knew that the ploughshare he was making would be used by the farmer down the lane, whose family he had known all his life, on soil that fed children he recognized by name. He knew the door hinge he was fitting would hang the gate on the church where he himself worshipped. The tools he made were not abstractions or commodities. They were objects that would enter into the daily physical life of his community, and they would be judged by the farmer in the field, by the carpenter at the building site, by the housewife at her gate, by whether they worked well and lasted long. This was not a distant market's judgment or a quality inspector's assessment. It was the immediate, personal, daily evaluation of his neighbors, people he lived among and would continue to live among for the rest of his life. This intimacy of accountability, this knowledge that his work would be used by people he knew, judged by people he would see tomorrow, was one of the structural features of medieval village craftsmanship that distinguished it from later industrial production. The smith could not produce inferior work and hide behind distance or anonymity. His ploughshares either held up through the ploughing season or they didn't, and if they didn't, the farmer came directly to him. His horseshoes either kept the horse sound on the road or they didn't. This directness of accountability was not merely a social pressure. It was a form of quality control embedded in the structure of village life, and it shaped the standards of the work produced within it. Segment 9. The Secret of the Edge. Of all the operations in the medieval blacksmith's repertoire, none was more consequential, and none more firmly rooted in a kind of practical metallurgical knowledge that its practitioners could employ with great reliability without ever having access to the scientific vocabulary that would later explain it, than the hardening and tempering of iron and steel. This was the secret of the edge. It was what transformed a well-shaped piece of metal into a cutting tool that would actually hold its sharpness through use, that would not bend or roll under the first contact with hard material, that would not snap with brittleness at the first lateral stress. Making a blade was one thing. Making a blade that worked, that held its edge through the demands of daily use, required this additional step. This further transformation of the metal by heat and quench that changed not just the shape of the object, but the very internal structure of the material. The metallurgy underlying hardening and tempering, though the medieval smith had no concept of it in scientific terms, is relatively straightforward to describe. Iron that has absorbed a significant amount of carbon in its structure, what we call steel, behaves differently from ordinary low-carbon wrought iron when rapidly cooled from high temperature. At high temperature, the iron's crystal structure changes into a form called austenite, which can hold carbon atoms distributed throughout the structure. If this austenite is cooled slowly, allowed to air cool, or cooled in a sandbox or ash heap, the carbon precipitates out in a controlled way and the iron returns to a softer, tougher form. But if the austenite is cooled very rapidly, plunged into water or oil, the carbon atoms are trapped in the iron structure, unable to redistribute, and a highly strained crystal form called martensite is created. Martensite is exceptionally hard, harder than the iron can achieve by any other means available to medieval technology, and this hardness is what allows a cutting edge to resist deformation and stay sharp. The problem with martensite is that it is also brittle. A blade fully hardened to martensite throughout its cross-section would hold a superb edge for precisely as long as it took for the first serious lateral stress to snap it. Fully hardened steel, struck at the wrong angle or twisted unexpectedly, shatters like glass. For tools that needed both hardness and toughness, that needed to cut well and resist breakage, the solution was tempering, a carefully controlled reheating of the hardened piece to a temperature well below the hardening heat, which allowed some of the internal stresses and brittleness of the martensite structure to be relieved while retaining most of the hardness. The trick was in the control, enough tempering heat to meaningfully improve toughness, not so much that the hardness gained in the quench was given back. The medieval smith controlled this process entirely through visual observation of the steel's surface color, and this color reading was as sophisticated and demanding as the reading of working heat, though operating over a very different and much narrower temperature range. After hardening, after the quench, the smith polished or lightly ground a section of the blade to bright metal, removing the dark oxide layer that the quench had left on the surface. He then applied heat carefully, either by holding the piece near the fire or by placing it gently in the coals at the very edge of the fire where the heat was mild and controllable. As the polished metal warmed, its surface began to show interference, colors produced by the growth of a thin transparent oxide layer, the same phenomenon that produces the colors of an oil film on water. These colors progressed in a specific sequence as temperature rose: pale yellow at around 220 degrees Celsius, deepening to a straw yellow at 230, then to a golden yellow, then to brown, then to purple, then to blue at around 300 degrees, and then to gray-blue and gray as temperature continued upward. Each of these colors corresponded to a specific level of tempering, and therefore to a specific compromise between hardness and toughness. Pale straw yellow, achieved at the lowest tempering temperatures, gave maximum retained hardness with minimum toughness improvement, appropriate for very hard cutting tools like engravers and scrapers that would experience primarily compressive forces and minimal lateral stress. Deeper yellow to brown, around 240 to 260 degrees, was the tempering color for most cutting tools. Knives, chisels, plane irons, draw knives. These tools needed a good cutting edge combined with sufficient toughness to resist the chip and snap hazards of hard use. Purple, around 270 to 280 degrees, was used for springs and tools requiring significant flexibility, something that needed to flex and return without breaking. Blue, at around 300 degrees, gave maximum toughness at the cost of significant hardness, appropriate for items like springs, axes used in wood chopping where severe lateral impact was likely, and tools that would be abused rather than carefully used. Running the temper colors, watching them appear and progress across the polished surface of the steel, required the smith's full and steady attention. The colors moved across the surface as a wave of heat spread through the piece. They did not appear all at once, but progressed from the point where heat was applied outward toward the edges and tip of the blade. The smith had to catch the color at the right moment, particularly difficult at the tip, which was the most critical area of a cutting tool, and which reached the advancing temperature wave last, giving the smith a brief window to quench the piece when the correct color arrived at the tip, while the body of the blade, which had been showing the color for longer, was not significantly over-tempered. This required watching the moving color front with complete focus and acting at exactly the right moment. quickly enough that the precise color at the tip was caught before it progressed to the next stage. For blades of complex geometry, those with varying thickness along their length, or tools with a thin cutting edge and a thick back, the differential thermal mass meant the temper colors raced ahead in the thin sections and lagged in the thick, making consistent tempering across the whole piece more challenging. Experienced smiths developed techniques to manage this, warming the piece from the back rather than the edge, so heat arrived at the edge last rather than first, using the anvil as a heat sink to cool one section while warming another, sometimes building a small bed of coals at a controlled low temperature and moving the piece in and out of contact with it in a precisely controlled sequence. These were the advanced techniques, the refinements of practice developed by individual smiths over careers of work and passed down through apprenticeship as part of the accumulated wisdom of the trade. Quenching media, the fluid into which the hot steel was plunged, also mattered, and the choice of quenching medium was one of the smith's significant variables. Water, the most available medium, quenched very rapidly and produced the hardest result. But the speed of the quench also produced the greatest stress in the steel and the greatest risk of cracking or warping during the rapid contraction. Oil, typically animal fat, tallow or vegetable oil in the medieval period, quenched more slowly and less violently, producing a slightly less hard result but with much less risk of cracking. For most cutting tools, oil quench was preferred. The hardness achieved was sufficient for excellent edge retention, and the reduced stress meant far fewer cracked or distorted blades, ruining the work of many heats. Water was reserved for situations where maximum hardness was essential, and the steel's composition or the tool's geometry made it likely to survive the violent quench without cracking. Some smiths used more exotic quenching media. Urine was recommended in some medieval and early modern texts as a quenching medium, the ammonia content giving a slightly different quench character. Some texts mentioned quenching in specific herbs or concoctions whose properties were understood empirically without any theoretical basis. These recommendations were not mere superstition, though they were not understood in scientific terms. Different quenching media did produce measurably different results in the treated steel, and smiths who observed these results carefully and systematically, who noticed that steel quenched in a particular way consistently came out harder or less prone to cracking, were operating as empirical scientists, drawing valid conclusions from careful observation, even without the theoretical framework to explain them. The finished edge, properly hardened and correctly tempered, then ground and honed to its final sharpness, was the culmination of all the work that had preceded it. All the carefully managed heats, the controlled shaping, the forge-welded steel edge, the quench and the temper, all of it existed in service of that edge. A well-made medieval cutting tool, produced by a skilled smith from good material with proper hardening and tempering, was a genuinely excellent object, not a primitive approximation of a modern tool but a highly refined product of accumulated expertise, capable of an edge sharpness and retention that compared favorably with much later production. Medieval knives, axes, and chisels recovered by archaeologists often show evidence of sophisticated heat treatment, hardened edges, differential hardness between edge and spine, careful tempering that preserved toughness. These were not accidents or guesses. They were the products of a tradition of practical metallurgical knowledge, passed down through the generations of the smith's trade, which understood precisely what it needed to achieve, and had developed reliable methods to achieve it. Segment 10. Fire as the only light. There is something that happens to a medieval smithy as the afternoon light fails. It is not a sudden change but a slow one, arriving so gradually that a man deep in his work might not consciously register it until he looks up and realizes that the window no longer shows sky but only a dark rectangle of nothing, and that the entire visible world has contracted to the radius of the forge fire's glow. The stone walls, black with soot, absorb what little light the fire throws rather than reflecting it back. The far corners of the building simply cease to exist. Visually, they are not dark so much as absent, beyond the boundary of what the fire's warmth can reach or illuminate. The anvil, the tool rack, the quench barrel, these things are still there, known and familiar, but they exist now in a zone of shifting amber and shadow rather than the steady grey light of day. The smithy has become a different place, smaller, more intense, reduced to what the fire chooses to reveal. This was the ordinary reality of autumn and winter evenings in a medieval smithy, and it was not occasional or exceptional. It was the condition under which a substantial portion of the year's work was done. In Northern Europe, where so much medieval smithing history is concentrated, the usable daylight in December amounts to perhaps 8 hours. A smith who stopped work at dusk in midwinter worked a very short day, and short days meant less work done, fewer tools completed, less income, and a harder life. So smiths worked on into the evening, as they had always done, by the light of the fire that was already burning for other purposes. The forge fire was not supplemented by candles or torches in most working smithies. Those were expensive, and more practically, open flames and scattered sparks in a building full of dry wood and leather were an obvious hazard. The forge fire itself was the light, and the forge fire, in its nature and its behavior, was a demanding light to work by. The quality of firelight is fundamentally different from daylight in ways that matter profoundly to a man trying to judge the temperature of iron by its color. Daylight, even the overcast, diffuse daylight of a northern European winter, is relatively consistent and broad spectrum. It illuminates evenly from above and fills shadows from multiple angles. It allows the eye to calibrate color with the reliability that comes from consistency. Forge firelight is nothing like this. It is localized, directional, constantly moving, and heavily weighted toward the orange and red end of the spectrum. It pulses with each breath of the bellows. It throws dramatic shadows that shift and dance with every change in the fire's intensity. It creates zones of brilliant orange illumination immediately around the hearth and rapidly deepening shadow in every direction away from it. Working in this light required a recalibration of the color reading skill that was itself demanding. The challenge was specific and serious. If the ambient light in the shop is already orange, already the color that iron produces at working heat, how does the smith read the color of his iron accurately? How does he distinguish between the orange glow of firelight falling on a piece of iron that is still cold and the genuine orange luminosity of iron that is hot enough to work? The answer lay in understanding the difference between reflected and radiated light. The iron that merely reflects the firelight looks different from the iron that is itself a source of heat and light. But making this distinction consistently and reliably across a full working evening, under the physical fatigue of a day already spent, required a level of perceptual training and discipline that was anything but automatic. Experienced smiths developed strategies for managing this difficulty. One was to shield the piece being assessed from direct firelight when checking its color, pulling it slightly away from the hearth, and viewing it against the darker background of the shop floor or the shadow of the anvil, where the ambient orange of the fire didn't compete as directly with the iron's own glow. Another was to use the character of the glow rather than just its color. Truly hot iron has a depth and saturation to its luminosity, a three-dimensional quality to the way it radiates heat and light that reflected firelight on cold metal lacks. This distinction between a piece of iron that is glowing because it is hot and a piece that merely looks orange in firelight was one that experienced smiths could make reliably and quickly, but it took years to develop and could not be taught through verbal description alone. It had to be seen, and seen again, and seen in enough different conditions that the perceptual system built a robust internal model of the difference. There was also the simple challenge of seeing clearly, in low and inconsistent light, over the course of a long working evening. The human eye is extraordinarily adaptable, and a smith working by firelight for hours would become thoroughly dark adapted in the areas of the shop away from the immediate glow of the hearth. But the forge fire itself was bright enough to prevent full dark adaptation in the eye looking into it, creating a constant adjustment between the brilliant zone of the hearth and the deep shadow of the rest of the building. When the smith looked at a piece of hot iron in the fire, his pupils were constricted by the brightness. When he looked away toward the tool rack or across to the quench barrel, he was briefly almost blind, his eyes slow to dilate back to accommodate the much lower light levels. This constant adjustment was tiring in a way that went beyond simple eye fatigue. It represented a continuous neurological demand, the visual system working harder than it would in consistent light to maintain effective function, beyond the challenges of color, reading and visual acuity. Working by firelight imposed physical demands on the whole conduct of the work. The placement of tools needed to be more consistent when the smith couldn't reliably see across the shop to locate them visually. Every hammer needed to be exactly where it was expected to be, every tong on its specific hook, the file and the chisel and the hardies all in their appointed places. Because searching for a mislaid tool in the orange and black world of the evening smithy wasted precious heat and created moments of distraction that were dangerous. The discipline of returning every tool to its exact place after each use, which was a habit of efficiency in daylight, became a habit of necessity in the dark. The organization of the shop that the smith had internalized so thoroughly that he could move through it in complete darkness was a real functional requirement in the firelit evenings of winter work. The floor was a hazard. Scale accumulated throughout the day, and what could be swept clear in the morning and checked through the day was harder to manage in the evening's half-light. The thin flakes of iron oxide spalled from hot metal were slippery underfoot, particularly on the stone floors common in established smithies, and a smith moving quickly from fire to anvil in reduced visibility needed to be careful. Pits in the floor from old quench water, the raised root of the anvil stump, the edge of the quench barrel, these things were known and navigated by habit in daylight. In firelight, they required the additional attention of a body moving through a landscape it couldn't fully see. Falls with hot iron in the tongs were not merely undignified, they were potentially life-threatening, and every smith who worked evening heats was managing this risk constantly. Even if the management had become so habitual it barely registered as conscious attention, the apprentice's role changed character somewhat in the evening work. His station at the bellows put him beside the hearth, in the zone of most light, which was in some ways an advantage for the work of maintaining the fire. But the quality of his attention to the bellows became even more important when the master was working by reduced light. An inconsistent air supply that caused the fire to pulse unevenly was always a problem. But in daytime the smith had visual reference points beyond the fire itself to orient his work. In the evening, the fire was the reference. An inconsistent fire meant an inconsistent light source, which made the already demanding task of color reading in firelight conditions even harder. The apprentice who understood this, who grasped that his steady, rhythmic work at the bellows was not merely feeding the fire, but stabilizing the light, was an apprentice who had understood something important about how all the elements of the shop worked together. Customers, farmers, tradesmen who came to collect finished work or discuss a commission, sometimes appeared at the forge door in the evening and paused for a moment on the threshold, struck by what they saw. The interior of a working smithy on a dark winter evening presented itself as a world entirely unlike the cold black outdoors. A dome of orange and amber light pulsing from the hearth, the dark silhouetted figure of the smith moving against the brightness, the anvil catching and scattering sparks with each hammer blow, the shower of orange scale drifting down like embers from a bonfire. The sound, the hiss of the bellows, the ring of the anvil, the hiss of hot iron plunged into the quench, reached out through the door into the cold before the light did. To the visitor standing outside in the dark, the forge was a world apart, lit from within, loud, hot, smelling of iron and char, apparently hostile to ordinary life, and yet producing the very things on which ordinary life depended. The smith himself, after a full day and then an evening's work, carried the forge in his body. The backs of his hands were reddened by the radiant heat of the fire. His eyes were slightly bloodshot from the constant adjustment between brightness and shadow. His shoulders and forearms ached with the dense, deep ache of sustained physical work. His hearing had been reduced marginally by the day's ringing of the anvil, a diminishment so gradual across a lifetime of smithing that it was never noticed as it happened, only apparent in the end as a general dulling of the auditory world. The fire had given him light to work by, had also, in the way of all hard things, taken something in return. What sustained him through the evening hours was partly the plain necessity of work that had to be done by a deadline. The farmer who needed his ploughshare by week's end, the merchant who had commissioned hinges for new warehouse doors, the Lord's steward who had sent a messenger twice already about the repair to the gate ironwork. Need was a powerful motivator in a world where the margin between comfortable and precarious was narrow. But there was also something else, harder to name. The quality of the work itself in the concentrated, reduced world of the firelit evening. The shop's contraction to the radius of the forge light created a kind of intense focus that the broader, more distracted light of the daytime didn't always provide. The world outside ceased to exist. The fire and the iron and the next blow of the hammer were everything there was. In the extremity of this reduction, in the simplicity of the evening smithy lit only by its own fire, the work achieved sometimes a quality of pure attention that the smith, if asked, might not have been able to describe in words, but would have recognized immediately as the condition in which his best work happened. He worked until the job was done, or until the fire told him it was time to stop. When the coals burned low enough that bringing the fire back up to working heat would cost more fuel than the remaining work justified, he let it subside. He banked the remaining coals carefully, raking them together, covering them with ash to slow the combustion and preserve as much warmth as possible for the morning. And he hung his tongs back on their hooks and his hammer on its peg by touch in the near darkness. He swept the worst of the scale roughly toward the wall with a boot. He stepped out of the forge and into the cold night air, and the sudden absence of the fire's heat and sound and smell was complete and slightly startling, the way silence is startling after a long time in noise. The village around him was dark and still. Above, if the sky was clear, there were stars in a quantity modern eyes would struggle to comprehend. The total absence of artificial light across the landscape allowed the full depth of the night sky to be visible, a blazing immensity that was simply the ordinary sky to the medieval eye. The smith, his eyes already dark adapted from the hour of working by firelight, would have seen this sky in its full richness. He was too tired to be poetic about it. He went to bed. Tomorrow the fire would need stoking before dawn. Segment 11, The Apprentice Watches. He was perhaps 12 years old when he first came to the smithy, brought by his father on an autumn morning when the mist was still on the fields and the forge smoke already rising. He was a farmer's son, the third of 5 children in a household that farmed a small holding of modest productivity, and the arrangement between his father and the smith was a practical one, negotiated with the straightforwardness that governed most such transactions in medieval village life. The smith needed a pair of young hands to work the bellows, carry water, keep the shop in order, and eventually, over years, not months, learn the trade well enough to become a journeyman and perhaps, eventually, a master in his own right. The boy's father needed one fewer mouth to feed through the winter, and the reassurance that his son was being established in a skilled and necessary trade, rather than condemned to a lifetime of agricultural labor on land that couldn't adequately support the family it already carried. Both men got something they needed. The boy stood between them and said nothing, because he had not been asked. The first weeks were not about iron. They were not even about fire, not in any direct sense. They were about water and sweeping and the precise organization of things. The boy's first task each morning was to bring water from the well to refill the quench barrel, a job that required 2 heavy trips with a bucket and was complicated in winter by the need to break the ice that formed on the well overnight. After the water came the sweeping, the scale from the previous day's work, the ash that had spilled from the hearth, the small scraps of iron and charcoal that accumulated on the floor in the course of a working day. The shop needed to be swept before work began, because loose scale underfoot was a hazard, and because a smith who worked in a cluttered shop was a smith whose attention was divided between the work and the environment, which was not acceptable. Cleanliness in the smithy was not fastidiousness, it was safety and efficiency, and the boy learned this lesson, not by being told it, but by observing the difference between how the smith moved through a swept, organized shop, and how he would have moved if the floor had been as the boy had left it before being corrected. He learned to feed the fire before he was trusted to do anything else with it. The bellows came first, the sustained rhythmic pumping that kept the coals alive during a heat. This was physically straightforward, but demanded a quality of attention that the boy initially struggled with. It was not enough to pump steadily. He had to pump in the way the work required, and the work's requirements changed constantly. During the initial heating of a cold piece, a moderate steady bellows rhythm was what the fire needed. As the iron approached working heat, the rhythm needed to increase slightly to drive the temperature higher in the time remaining. When the smith pulled the iron and went to the anvil, the boy had to maintain the fire at temperature without burning it down too fast, a judgment call about how much air to supply to coals that no longer had cold metal in them, absorbing their heat, and which would therefore run hotter than they had during the heat. Getting this wrong, oversupplying air to an unloaded fire, consumed charcoal wastefully and could bring the fire to a temperature that would damage the next piece when it was buried. The smith did not always explain what was wrong when the boy made this error. He looked at the fire, looked at the boy, and the quality of that look was its own complete communication. What the boy was doing during all of this, while he pumped the bellows, while he swept, while he carried water and replenished charcoal and occasionally ran an errand to the charcoal merchant or the iron dealer, was watching. This was the central fact of his education, the method by which the craft was being transmitted to him, whether or not any explicit teaching was happening. He watched the smith select a piece of iron from the stock and assess it with his hands before deciding where to start. He watched how the tongs were fitted to the stock before the iron went into the fire. He watched the smith's eyes as they monitored the color of the heating iron, how the gaze rested on the fire with a quality of patient, calibrated attention that was neither casual nor anxious, but something in between. Alert readiness. He watched the moment of decision, the brief pause, the reaching for the tongs, the smooth pull from the fire, and tried to understand what the smith had seen that told him the iron was ready. He watched at the anvil with particular intensity, because the anvil was the mystery. He could understand, at a general level, what the bellows and the fire were doing. Heat was heat. The principle was not obscure. But what happened at the anvil was not immediately legible. He saw his master swing the hammer, and he saw the iron change shape. But the connection between the specific angle and force of each blow and the specific change it produced in the metal was not at first apparent to him. He saw hammer blows and he saw results, but the causality between them was opaque. Over weeks and months, this opacity began to dissolve. He began to see not just that the iron moved, but how it moved, that a blow on the top of a bar made it spread sideways, that a blow at the edge pushed material away, that the rotation of the tong hand between blows was not random repositioning but purposeful orientation, presenting the exact face of the iron that needed to be worked next. The shape of the finished piece was present in his master's actions from the first blow, as a kind of intention expressed through the sequence of strikes. The boy began to read this intention, to follow the logic of the hammerwork, to see where it was going before it arrived. This was an education that happened entirely through the eyes, and was processed not in the language-using, consciously reasoning part of the mind, but in the deeper bodily intelligence that governs skilled physical action. The boy was not taking notes. He was not formulating rules. He was building an internal model of what blacksmithing was, a simulation, if the word can be used without anachronism, of the physical relationships and sequential logic of the craft that would eventually allow his own body to perform what he had watched so many hundreds of times. This is how all serious physical skills are learned, and the medieval apprenticeship system was built around this reality, with a practical wisdom that modern vocational training has sometimes struggled to replicate. The duration of a proper apprenticeship, 7 years in many guild traditions, often more in practice, was not arbitrary. It was calibrated to the actual time required for this deep bodily learning to happen, for the watched skill to migrate from observation into embodied competence. His first real metalwork, when it came, was deliberately elementary, making nails. In the medieval period, nails were not stamped from sheet metal by machine. They were made by hand, from nail rod, one at a time, and they were made in enormous quantities by every smithy in the country, representing a substantial portion of the routine output of the trade. Making a nail required cutting a length of nail rod to size, heating it, drawing a taper on one end to form the point, upsetting the other end to form the head, and finishing. It was a simple sequence, clearly bounded, repeatable, and forgiving enough that errors were instructive rather than disastrous. A bent or malformed nail was wasted material and wasted time, but it was not a catastrophe. And the simplicity of the nail sequence meant that the boy could practice the fundamental operations: heating, moving quickly from fire to anvil, hammer control, reading the cooling iron, without the additional cognitive load of a complex shaping challenge. His first heats were ugly. The iron didn't go where he intended. His hammer blows were too tentative. He had watched his master strike with authority, and he understood intellectually that hesitant blows wasted the heat without moving the metal. But his body had not yet found the confidence to translate this understanding into action. When he struck harder, trying to correct this, he found that force without direction produced results that were merely different kinds of wrong. The taper he was trying to draw came out crooked, irregular, thicker on one side than the other. He returned the piece to the fire again and again, each time finding that what he had done in the previous heat had left him with a shape that was harder to work with than the shape he had started with. The smith watched some of these early heats from across the shop, saying very little. Occasionally he would take the piece from the boy's tongs and make 2 or 3 blows, silently demonstrating something specific, the angle that was needed here, the rotation that was missing there, and then hand it back. The demonstration was complete and said everything. Words would have said less. Gradually, over months of daily practice on nails, and then on simple hooks and staples and rings, the boy's body began to acquire the knowledge his eyes had been accumulating. His hammer blows found their authority. His tong hand learned to anticipate the repositioning the next blow would need, rather than responding after the fact. His eyes developed sensitivity to the cooling curve of the iron. He began to feel, rather than consciously calculate, the remaining working time in a heat, and to plan his blows accordingly. He was not yet skilled. He would not be skilled for years yet, but he had crossed a threshold. The work had begun to make sense from the inside, not just from observation. He was beginning to be a smith. The relationship between master and apprentice in a medieval smithy was not warmly pedagogical in the modern sense. There was affection in some partnerships and genuine harshness in others, and most fell somewhere between these poles. A functional, daily closeness between two people who worked in the same confined space for years, who knew each other's rhythms and habits and capabilities intimately, whose work was literally coordinated at the level of heartbeat and muscle. The master was not the apprentice's friend or his teacher in any formal sense. He was his employer, his housekeeper, and his model, the living example of what mastery looked like, present and observable every single day. The apprentice's task was to absorb this example, not to be told about it. What passed between them was the craft itself, transmitted in the only way it could be transmitted, through presence, through observation, through repetition, through the correction of errors made in real work on real material. The knowledge that moved from master to apprentice was not the kind of knowledge that can be written down and recovered from a text. It was the kind of knowledge that lives in the hands and the eyes, in the calibrated perception and coordinated motor response of a body that has spent years in relationship with fire and iron. It was the kind of knowledge that, if the line of transmission were ever broken, if a generation passed without anyone learning from someone who already knew, would simply be gone. Not forgotten, because it was never stored in the form of words that could be forgotten. Just gone, like a skill that was never written down and had no practitioner left alive. The guild system of medieval Europe, with its formal progression from apprentice to journeyman to master, was among other things a system for ensuring that this embodied knowledge did not disappear. By structuring the transmission, ensuring that every young smith spent sufficient time in close contact with genuine mastery, that journeyman traveled and worked under different masters and accumulated breadth of experience before settling. That masters were required to demonstrate and maintain a standard of craft before they could teach. The guilds were preserving, not information but capability, the knowledge of how iron behaves at different temperatures, how hammer angles direct metal flow, how the fire should be managed for different kinds of work. This knowledge lived in people, not in books, and the continuity of people who held it was the continuity of the craft. The apprentice, standing at his bellows on a winter evening, watching sparks spiral upward from his master's hammer blows and drift toward the black ceiling, was part of this continuity, whether he knew it or not. He was the next link in a chain that stretched back through centuries of smiths before his master, each one having stood where he was standing, watched what he was watching, and gradually become what his master now was. He would spend years in this shop. He would leave it as a journeyman and work in other shops and under other masters. He would, if all went well, establish a smithy of his own, take on his own apprentice, and stand on the other side of the forge fire watching a young boy learn to pump the bellows with the steady rhythm the fire needed. The chain would continue. The fire would be kept. Segment 12. What the fire built. When the last heat of the day was done and the fire banked, when the tongs hung back on their hooks and the hammer was rested against the anvil stump, the smithy settled into a silence that held within it the whole weight of the day's work. The finished pieces, if there were finished pieces, for not every day produced something complete, sat cooling on the stone floor or on the shelf beside the door, waiting to be collected. A ploughshare, perhaps, a set of door hinges, a billhook for the woodsman up the lane, a repaired wheel hub, its iron tire reset and sound again. These objects, plain and functional, gave no obvious signal of the labor that had produced them. They were dark and heavy and unremarkable. To the eye that didn't know better, they might have been found objects, things that had simply existed, rather than things that had been willed into being from raw material through fire and skill and sustained physical effort. This was the paradox at the heart of the blacksmith's work. His most successful pieces were the ones that looked as though they had never been made, but they had been made, and the world in which they functioned depended on them with an intimacy that was total. Medieval civilization, not in its cathedrals and its manuscripts and its theological debates, but in its daily, grinding, feeding itself, functioning, was built overwhelmingly from iron. The ploughshare was the central tool of European agriculture, the thing without which the heavy clay soils of northern Europe could not be turned deeply enough to produce the yields that fed growing populations. A ploughshare wore out. It had to be repaired, re-edged, eventually replaced. The blacksmith was the person who did this, not occasionally or in emergencies, but as routine, season after season, year after year. Without the smith's ability to maintain the ploughshares of the village, the fields could not be cultivated on schedule. Without cultivation on schedule, the harvest failed or diminished. Without the harvest, people went hungry. The chain from the forge to the table was direct and short, and every link in it depended on the smith's fire burning and his hammer falling. The same chain ran through every other part of medieval material life. Millstones ground grain into flour, but the mill could not function without iron fittings. The spindle, the rind that supported the runner stone, the iron bands that held the millstones, wooden housing together under the enormous forces of grinding operation. When these fittings wore out or broke, the mill stopped. The mill stopping meant no flour. No flour meant no bread. The miller went to the smith. The mill was repaired. This happened not in crises, but as the ordinary maintenance rhythm of a working mill. And it happened because a smith with fire and iron and skill was available within a practical distance. The geographic distribution of blacksmiths across medieval Europe, studies of guild records, tax rolls, and documentary sources suggest there was a working smith within a few miles of virtually every settled community of meaningful size. Was not an accident of commercial convenience. It was a requirement of functional daily life, as fundamental as the distribution of mills or markets. Consider the carpenter, whose trade is often imagined as entirely a matter of wood. The medieval carpenter worked with iron constantly. His saws were iron, his chisels were iron-edged, his auger bits, his draw knives, his adzes, the nails and spikes and brackets that held his joinery together, all iron, all made by a smith, all subject to wear and breakage and the need for repair or replacement. A master carpenter, with a shop full of good tools, worked effectively. A carpenter whose tools were dull, broken, or missing, worked badly and slowly, and his finished work showed it. The quality of the blacksmith's craft expressed itself indirectly but powerfully through the quality of every other craft that depended on iron tools. Good smith, good carpenter, better buildings, better furniture, better wagons. The whole practical world was interconnected in this way, with the smithy at the root of very many of the connections. The wheelwright who built and maintained the wagons and carts that were the arteries of medieval commerce depended on the smith. For the iron tires that held his wooden wheels together, without those iron bands, a wooden wheel subjected to the stresses of medieval road surfaces would begin to loosen and disintegrate within a short period of use. He depended on the smith for the axle pins and linchpins and hub fittings, without which the wheel could not be mounted or retained on its axle. The horse that pulled the cart wore iron shoes, fitted by a farrier who was often the same man as the village blacksmith, maintaining the animal's hooves and working ability on which the whole transport system depended. The harness that connected horse to cart included iron buckles, rings, and fittings at every critical junction. Remove the ironwork from a medieval cart, and you have a collection of shaped wooden parts that cannot function as a vehicle. The iron was not decoration or addition. It was structure. In warfare, and the medieval period was a period in which warfare was a recurring, structuring reality of political life. Iron's role was even more nakedly fundamental. A knight was iron on horseback, his armor and his weapons representing an enormous investment of smithing labor as well as raw material. But the knight was the visible apex of a military system that was iron all the way down. The common foot soldier carried an iron-tipped spear or an iron-headed bill. The archers' arrowheads were iron, made by the hundreds of thousands for any significant military campaign. The castle gate hung on iron hinges and was secured with iron hardware. The portcullis was iron. The chains that raised the drawbridge were iron. The tools with which the castle had been built, the picks and mattocks of the laborers, the chisels of the masons were iron. Siege engines were held together with iron bolts. The logistics of medieval warfare were inseparable from the logistics of iron supply, and armies on campaign required working smiths in their train, not as a luxury but as an operational necessity, to repair weapons and armor and equipment in the field. The church, which was the other great organizing institution of medieval life, alongside secular lordship, was equally dependent on iron. The great cathedrals of medieval Europe are celebrated for their stone, for the soaring vaulted ceilings, the carved facades, the stained glass. But the construction of those cathedrals required enormous quantities of iron. The cramps and dowels that held stone courses together, the scaffolding hardware, the tools of the masons and carpenters and glaziers, the ironwork of the permanent structure including hinges, locks, grills, and all the functional ironwork of a large and complex building. The process of building a major medieval cathedral, which might extend over generations, was also a process of sustained, large-scale iron production and smithing. and the quantities of iron involved were substantial enough to have left detectable traces in the archaeological record near major building sites. Beyond these large institutional uses, the ordinary domestic life of the medieval household was threaded through with iron at every practical point. The cooking pot hung over the fire on an iron pot hook. The fire was managed with iron tongs and a poker. The door was hung on iron hinges and fastened with an iron latch or lock. The knife used to cut bread at the table was iron, specifically the iron and steel composite blade that a skilled smith made with a steel cutting edge, forge welded to an iron body, producing a blade that was both sharp and affordable. The scissors used for sewing were iron. The needles, strictly, were often iron in the medieval period, before fine wire drawing made steel needles widely available. The bucket handle was iron. The barrel hoops were iron. The plough, the family's strip of land was turned with, was iron at its working edges. Iron was everywhere, doing quiet, functional work, entirely unremarkable, precisely because it was ubiquitous and well-made. None of this iron maintained itself. Every piece was subject to wear, to corrosion, to breakage under the stresses of use. A ploughshare striking a buried stone at the wrong angle could chip or crack its edge. A knife used daily on a wooden board became dull and needed re-edging. An iron gate hinge subjected to years of weather and movement eventually cracked or wore loose. The ongoing maintenance of the iron world, not just its original creation but its continuous repair and renewal, represented a substantial part of the smith's actual daily work. Less glamorous than making new tools, but equally essential to the functioning of the community around him. The smith, who could only make new things but could not repair damaged ones, was only half a craftsman. The ability to diagnose what had gone wrong with a piece, why it had broken at this point, why this edge had failed, and to remedy it correctly, either by repair or by making a better replacement that addressed the original weakness, was a sophisticated professional skill as highly valued as the ability to make fine work from scratch. The smith himself, in this web of dependency, was not wealthy by the standards of the merchant class or the landed gentry, but he held a position of practical importance that translated into a kind of social security rarely available to those who depended on agriculture alone. When harvests failed and peasant farmers faced destitution, the smith's skills remained needed. People still required tools and repairs even in hard times, perhaps especially in hard times, when worn equipment could not be replaced with new and repair became more rather than less critical. The guild system, in towns and larger settlements, formalized this security into institutional form. Membership in the Smiths Guild brought not just professional regulation and the protection of trade standards, but a community of mutual support, a network of fellow craftsmen with whom information, assistance, and in extremity material support could be exchanged. In smaller villages, outside the guild structure, the smith's position was maintained by simpler social logic. He was needed by everyone, and everyone knew it. This was not leverage he was likely to exploit aggressively in a community where he expected to live his entire life, surrounded by the people who needed his work and whose good opinion was his social environment. But it did mean that when the harvest was thin and credit was required, it was available. When a new tool was needed urgently and immediate payment was impossible, the arrangement could be made. The smith's skills were his currency, and his currency was always in demand. What was built by the medieval blacksmith's fire, over generations, over centuries, was not just the accumulated stock of iron objects in daily use across a continent. It was the physical substrate of a civilization, the working infrastructure of agriculture, construction, transport, and craft on which everything else rested. The cathedrals are still standing, and we look at them with appropriate wonder. The manuscripts are preserved in libraries, and scholars read them with care. But the ploughshare that fed the family, that tithed the grain, that paid the priest, who kept the church, that eventually accumulated the wealth to build the cathedral. The ploughshare is not in a museum. It wore out, as it was supposed to. It was repaired and re-edged and repaired again, and eventually replaced. And the replaced piece wore out in its turn, and the cycle continued for as long as there was land to farm and a smith within reach to maintain the tools. Nothing of this survives except as traces in the soil and fragments in the archaeological record. But it was the foundation, the men who forged these things, who rose before dawn and stoked the fire and worked through short winter days and firelit evenings, whose hands were scarred and whose hearing was dulled and whose backs ached from decades of standing work, were not remembered the way kings and generals and architects were remembered. They did not, for the most part, sign their work. They did not commission chronicles or fund the illumination of manuscripts that would preserve their names. They were buried in the churchyard like everyone else, and the churchyard gradually lost even the legibility of their gravestones. Their names are gone. The tools are gone. What remains is only the fact of the world they made possible. The fed populations, the built structures, the functioning trade, the working farms, expressed now only in the language of historical demography and archaeology, impersonal and statistical, stripped of the individual lives that produced it. But those lives were lived. Each morning the fire was lit. Each evening it was banked. The iron came in raw and left finished and useful. The apprentice watched and slowly learned. The seasons turned and the work continued, summer and winter, in heat and cold, by daylight and by the fire's own glow. The craft passed from hand to hand, as it had always passed, not in books but in standing beside someone who knew and watching until you knew too. The bellows breathed, the hammer fell, the iron moved, and the world that everyone in it depended on was quietly, daily, invisibly maintained by men who understood fire and iron and the precise language of the hammer, and who asked for nothing from history except to be left to their work. The fire is long cold now. The anvils are in museums, or buried under fields, or melted down into something else centuries ago. But the shape of the world they made, the agricultural revolution of the heavy plough, the connected world of iron-wheeled trade, the great stone buildings that needed iron bones to stand, that shape persists in the landscape and the culture and the very possibility of the civilization that came after. The blacksmith forged it, by firelight, in the cold before dawn, in the hot and noisy dark of a winter evening, one heat at a time. And so, traveler, we reach the end of this long and smoky road. We have stood in the dark before dawn with the blacksmith as he crossed his frost-hardened yard, breathing the cold air of a world not yet awake. We have crouched beside the hearth and felt the residual warmth of yesterday's coals pressing back against our palms, and we have watched the charcoal catch and brighten as the bellows found their rhythm. We have learned that fire is not a background detail in this story. It is the story, the beginning and the engine of everything, the force that transforms cold black iron into the living, glowing material that a skilled pair of hands can shape into something the world needs. We have looked through the smith's eyes at the color of heated iron, learning to see the difference between the dull, reluctant cherry of metal, not yet ready, and the blazing yellow-white of a heat approaching its limit. Understanding that this visual vocabulary, built into perception through years of repetition and mistaken correction, was the only thermometer available to a medieval craftsman, and that it was, in the right hands, more than sufficient. We have stood at the anvil and run our hand across its scarred, patient face, understanding that its weight and hardness and carefully shaped surfaces were not incidental but designed, through centuries of accumulated practical knowledge, to present exactly the right geometry for the enormous variety of work that passed across it every day. We have felt the grip of the tongs, the decisive pull of iron from the fire, the brief urgent walk to the anvil, and the focused intensity of those 60 or 90 seconds of workable heat that structured every sequence of fire and hammer. Fire and hammer, fire and hammer, fire and hammer and higher and hammer, fire and higher and haffer and haffer and haffer, aaron ha hacks fire and ha and rapper and ha and hap and hammed spad plub hammer ba web wah alasak bad apple wed apple tapu bad at ha da kaf ga sata ha fat cat have that's put us back would stag us with tables skakten bluff with the backes vote with wars and we have watched the hammer speak. We have understood, perhaps for the first time, that those blows raining down on glowing iron were not violence but language, a precise, nuanced, endlessly variable vocabulary of angle and force and timing by which the smith translated intention into form, directing the flow of hot plastic metal the way a river is directed by its banks, with patience and knowledge and the deep authority of long mastery. What these 6 segments have tried to do, and what the 6 that follow will continue, is to close the distance between us and those men who stood at forge fires 1,000 years ago. That distance is real. Their world was harder, colder, darker, and more physically demanding than most of us will ever know. They had no electric light, no power tools, no safety equipment beyond the leather of their aprons and the calluses of their skin. They worked in smoke and heat and noise, by firelight and by the dim grey light of small windows, for the whole of their lives, and most of them died without their names being recorded anywhere a historian could find them. But the distance is not as vast as it sometimes seems, because the things that made them good at what they did are not things that belong only to the medieval world. The patience to learn a skill slowly and completely, the willingness to let knowledge move from the mind into the body through years of practice, the discipline to read the material you are working with rather than imposing on it what you want to see, the care taken with tools, with fire, with the sequence of operations, the understanding that good work requires good preparation, and that the quality of the finished piece is inseparable from the quality of the attention brought to every step that led to it. These are not medieval virtues. They are human ones, as alive today as they were in any smoky firelit smithy, in any village, in any century you care to name. The smith whose story we have been following, and who is, of course, every medieval blacksmith, and no particular one, a figure assembled from historical evidence and the logic of the craft, did not think of himself as making history. He thought of himself as making a set of plough fittings for the farmer across the lane and getting them done before the end of the week. He thought about whether his charcoal supply would last until the next delivery. He thought about whether the apprentice was ready to begin real hammerwork, or whether he needed another season at the bellows first. He thought about the price the Lord Steward had offered for the gate hinges, and whether it was worth arguing about. He thought about the cold on his walk across the yard, and the warmth waiting inside the forge, and the work that was there in front of him. He did not know that we would be here, centuries later, sitting in warm rooms lit by electric light, reading about his mornings. He would have found the idea bewildering, probably. And yet here we are, drawn back across all that time by something that does not diminish with distance, which is the simple human fascination with skill, with watching or imagining someone do something very difficult very well, with understanding how a thing is made by people who truly know how to make it. The forge fire has been cold for a long time now in the shops those men worked in. The buildings are gone, or altered past recognition, or buried under later construction. The anvils may still exist somewhere. Good iron outlasts almost everything, sitting in museums or antique collections, or still in use in modern smithies, where the craft continues, changed in its tools and fuels and context, but recognizable in its fundamental nature. The knowledge those men carried has not entirely disappeared either. It passed hand to hand, generation to generation, surviving the centuries in the bodies of those who kept practicing the trade, and it is still alive today in the hands of smiths who heat iron in modern gas forges and read its color by the same visual vocabulary their medieval predecessors used. The fire goes quiet at the end of the day. The coals are banked to hold their heat through the night, the tools hung back in their places, the scales swept from the floor, the quench barrel topped up for tomorrow. The smith stands for a moment in the cooling shop, feeling the ache in his shoulders that marks a good day's work, looking at the pieces completed and hung on their peg or laid on the shelf, the plough fittings, the door hinge, the knife blade cooling on the stone bench, holding its new edge. The firelight that was so fierce and urgent all day has subsided to a warm glow, painting the soot-black walls in amber and shadow. Outside, the village is quieting for the night, fires banked in cottage hearths, dogs settling, children pulled in from the cold, the stars coming out above the common, hard and clear, in the way stars are only in a world without electric light, a sky so thick with stars it has actual texture, layers of brightness, depth you can almost fall into. The blacksmith stands for a moment at the door of his shop and looks up at it, as men have always looked up at such skies when the day's work is done and the night is clean and quiet and their own. He will be back at first light. The coals will still be warm. The iron will be waiting. Good night, traveler. Thank you for walking the length of this firelit road with us tonight. May your rest be as deep and earned as a blacksmith's after a long day at the forge, and may you wake tomorrow with the same quiet certainty he did, that the work is there, that the fire is waiting, and that your hands still know what to do. Until the next segment, until the next heat, until the hammer rings again. The Forge, signing off.